What if Luffy never had to wait for Shanks to return? What if Red Hair looked at that 7-year-old who lost his arm for him and said, "Screw it, you're coming with me"? This concept is absolutely broken. And here's why: instead of bumbling around East Blue learning everything the hard way, Luffy gets trained by a Yonko crew from age 7. We're talking hockey mastery before he's even a teenager, tactical genius from Ben Beckman, and exposure to New World politics while most kids are learning multiplication tables. But the real kicker: his future crewmates don't just sit around waiting. Zoro becomes Mihawk's bounty hunting partner. Nami builds a navigation empire. They all become legends in their own right. When they finally reunite, it's not as captain and crew, it's as equals who chose each other. Picture this: teenage Luffy throwing hands with Big Mom, actually understanding the stakes at Marineford, and ultimately becoming the pirate king who unites the world instead of conquering it. If that doesn't sound epic, I don't know what does. Smash like, hit subscribe, and let's jump into this wild ride. The morning sun painted Fuchsia Village in shades of gold and orange, same as it had every day for the past 8 years. Luffy sat on the dock, legs dangling in the water, staring at the horizon like he always did. 15 now, taller but still scrawny, still wearing that same ratty straw hat that had seen better decades. "You're gonna be late for work again," Makino called from the bar's doorway, but her tone was more fond than scolding. She'd given up on actually getting him to show up on time years ago. "Just 5 more minutes," Luffy called back, not turning around. The ocean was different today. He could feel it in his bones, the same way old fishermen claimed they could smell storms before the sky darkened. Something was coming. Mayor Whoop Slap waddled over, adjusting his tiny hat. "Boy, you can't spend your whole life waiting for pirates who ain't coming back. That red-haired fool probably doesn't even remember this place." Luffy's hand tightened on the dock's edge. Everyone said that. Everyone thought Shanks had forgotten about him, about his promise. But promises weren't meant to be broken, right? That's what Shanks had taught him. "He'll come back," Luffy said, same words he'd been saying for 8 years. He promised. A speck appeared on the horizon, then another. Luffy squinted, heart hammering against his ribs. 3 ships flying familiar colors, red and white, skull and crossbones with 3 scars over the left eye socket. "Shanks!" Luffy launched himself off the dock, nearly face-planting in his excitement. "Shanks is back!" The whole village stirred to life. Some people ran toward their houses to hide valuables. Others gathered at the docks, curious despite themselves. Pirates meant trouble, but these pirates had never hurt anyone here. Still, 8 years was a long time. People changed. The Red Force pulled into harbor like she owned it, magnificent and terrifying. Luffy had forgotten how massive she was, how the mere sight of her could make grown men nervous. The gangplank dropped with a heavy thud. Shanks stepped off first and Luffy's breath caught. The man looked exactly the same: wild red hair, easy grin, missing left arm, and those eyes that seemed to see everything. Behind him came the crew Luffy remembered. Ben Beckman with his cigarette and rifle, Lucky Roo with his meat, Yasopp looking sharp as ever. "Well, well," Shanks drawled, scanning the crowd until his gaze landed on Luffy. His grin widened. "Look what we have here. Last time I saw you, you barely came up to my knee." Luffy couldn't move, couldn't speak. 8 years of imagined conversations, of things he'd planned to say, and his tongue felt glued to the roof of his mouth. "Still got the hat, I see," Shanks continued, walking closer. "Kept it in good shape, too." Luffy's voice cracked. He cleared his throat, trying to sound older, more mature. "I took care of it. Just like I promised. Good man." Shanks reached out and flicked the hat's brim. "You've grown up, Luffy, really grown up." There was something in his tone, a note Luffy couldn't quite identify. Surprise, pride. Before he could figure it out, shouts erupted from the village's main road. "Pirates! The red hair pirates are here!" But these weren't villagers shouting. The voices were too harsh, too disciplined. Luffy spun around to see Marines flooding into the square, dozens of them, maybe more, led by a massive man with a jaw that looked like it could crack walnuts. "Red-haired Shanks," the Marine captain bellowed. "By order of Marine headquarters, you're under arrest," Shanks sighed. "Ironjaw Kozuki, heard you'd been promoted, congratulations." "Captain Kozuki to you, scum." The Marine's hand rested on his sword hilt. "We know you've been using this village as a base, corrupting innocent civilians." "Now that's just hurtful," Shanks said, but his crew was already spreading out behind him. Luffy recognized the formation. They taught it to him years ago during their games. "We're just visiting old friends." 200 Marines, Shanks, Kozuki sneered. "Even you can't fight those odds. Surrender now and maybe we'll go easy on the village." Luffy's stomach dropped. 200, he looked around frantically. Makino had gone pale, Mayor Whoop's slap was backing away, even some of the red hair pirates looked tense. Boys, Shanks said quietly, looks like we've got ourselves a situation. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Marines fingered their weapons, pirates checked their own. The villagers caught between them looked ready to bolt. Then Luffy saw something that made his blood run cold. Ben Beckman, Shanks' first mate and the smartest man Luffy had ever met, was cut off from the others. Somehow during the positioning, he'd ended up surrounded by 20 Marines near the market stalls. His rifle was across his back, cigarette dangling from his lips, but Luffy could see the calculation in his eyes. 20-1, even for Beckman, would be pushing it. One of the Marines raised his rifle. "Behind you," Luffy shouted, but it was too late. The Marine fired. Beckman spun, fast as lightning, but more rifles were already aiming. He was trapped and everyone knew it. Something hot and terrible rose in Luffy's chest. These weren't enemies in some distant battle. This was his village, his people, his family. Beckman had taught him to skip stones, had shown him how to tie proper sailor's knots, had always saved him extra food when Shanks wasn't looking. They wouldn't get away from him. The words tore from Luffy's throat, carrying with them something he didn't understand, something that felt like thunder and lightning and the rage of the ocean itself. The world went silent except for the roar in his ears. Every Marine within 50 feet of Beckman collapsed, just dropped, like someone had cut their strings. The ones further away staggered, eyes rolling back before crumpling to the ground. Even some of the villagers swayed on their feet. Luffy stood in the sudden quiet, chest heaving, not understanding what had happened. Around him, unconscious Marines littered the ground like scattered toys. Only the strongest were still standing, Kozuki, maybe 30 of his men, and all of the red hair pirates who were staring at Luffy with expressions he'd never seen before. "What?" Kozuki's voice shook. "What was that?" Shanks was looking at Luffy like he was seeing him for the first time. "Conqueror's hockey," he said softly. "Untrained, unconscious," but he shook his head in amazement. "Kid, do you know what you just did?" Luffy didn't. His legs felt wobbly and his head was spinning. Beckman was gonna get hurt. I couldn't let them." 150, Ben Beckman said, stepping over the unconscious Marines surrounding him. His cigarette had never left his lips. "Kid just knocked out 150 Marines with raw Conqueror's hockey." "Impossible," Kozuki snarled. "He's just a village brat." "Run," Shanks said quietly. "What?" "I said run." Shanks' voice dropped to something dangerous. "Take your remaining men and run, Kozuki, before I decide the boys got the right idea about dealing with people who threaten his friends." For a moment, it looked like the Marine captain might argue. Then he saw Shanks' expression, really saw it, and whatever he found there made him step back. "This isn't over, red hair." "No," Shanks agreed. "It's not. Next time maybe don't pick a fight in a place that means something to me." Kozuki gathered his conscious Marines and retreated, dragging their unconscious comrades. Within minutes, the village square was empty except for pirates and very confused villagers. Luffy sank onto a nearby crate, suddenly exhausted. "What's Conqueror's hockey?" "Something you're born with," Shanks said, sitting beside him. "Something that can't be learned or taught, only awakened. The will to stand above others, to make them bow without even trying." He studied Luffy's face. "I knew you had it 8 years ago, sensed the potential. But this," he gestured at the unconscious Marines, "this is beyond anything I expected." "Is it bad?" Shanks laughed, but it wasn't entirely happy. "Kid, you just did something most pirates spend their whole lives trying to achieve. And you did it because you were worried about a friend." The weight of that settled over them. Luffy looked at his hands, half expecting them to look different somehow. They didn't. Same calluses from rope work, same scar on his knuckle from when he'd tried to prove how tough he was at age 7. "Luffy," Shanks said, and something in his tone made everyone stop what they were doing. "I came here to check on you. See how you were doing, maybe share some stories about our adventures. But now," he stood up, walking to the edge of the dock where he could see the ocean. When he turned back, his expression was serious in a way Luffy had only seen once before, the day they'd said goodbye. "The Marines know about you now. Word's gonna spread that red-haired Shanks has a connection to a boy with Conqueror's hockey in East Blue. They'll be back with more men, more ships. And they won't be gentle about it." Mayor Whoop stepped forward. "Now see here, I'm not finished." Shanks' voice cut through the protest. "Luffy, you've got 2 choices. You can stay here and I'll make sure the villagers are protected. Set up some defenses, maybe ask some favors from people who owe me. You'll be safe, but you'll always be looking over your shoulder." Luffy's heart was already sinking. He knew what the other choice would be. Or, Shanks continued, you can come with me, right now, today, learn to control that power you just showed, see the world, find out what it really means to be a pirate. The silence stretched forever. Luffy could hear his own heartbeat, the lap of waves against the dock, Makino's sharp intake of breath. If I go, he said slowly, when would I see everyone again? Shanks didn't lie to him, never had. I don't know, kid, maybe years. Maybe never, the Grand Line's not a place you visit on weekends. Luffy looked around at the only home he'd ever known, at Makino, who'd bandaged his scrapes and made sure he ate vegetables. At Mayor Whoop Slap, who'd complained about every stupid thing Luffy had ever done but had never actually stopped him. At the villagers who'd watched him grow up, who'd tolerated his dreams even when they thought he was crazy. Then he looked at Shanks, at the man who'd given him his greatest treasure and his biggest dream. At the crew who'd shown him what friendship could look like. At Ben Beckman, who was alive and smoking his cigarette because Luffy had found strength he didn't know he had. If I stay, Luffy said, will I regret it? That's not for me to say. If I go, you'll probably regret that too sometimes. Shanks smiled sadly. That's what it means to choose, Luffy. Every path closes off others. Luffy stood up, his legs steady again. The straw hat felt heavier on his head, like it was reminding him of the weight of promises. He walked over to Makino first. I have to go, he said, and his voice only cracked a little. She knelt down so they were eye level, even though he was almost as tall as her now. I know, she said, and hugged him tight enough to crack ribs. I've always known, just don't forget us completely, okay? Never, he promised into her shoulder. Mayor Whoop Slap was crying and trying to hide it. Stupid boy, he muttered. Stupid, reckless, impossible boy. Luffy hugged him too, because sometimes adults needed hugs even when they pretended they didn't. When he turned back to Shanks, the pirate was watching with something that might have been pride. You sure about this, kid? Luffy touched the brim of his hat, felt the familiar straw beneath his fingers, and thought about promises and dreams and the way it had felt to protect someone who mattered. Yeah, he said, I'm sure. Shanks grinned, and suddenly he looked like the man who'd saved Luffy from the Sea King all those years ago, confident, powerful, ready for anything. Well then, he said, extending his hand. Welcome to the crew, Monkey D. Luffy. Luffy took the offered hand and felt his old life slip away like morning mist. Whatever came next, whatever the Grand Line had in store for him, he'd face it as a red-hair pirate. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, full of possibilities and dangers and adventures he couldn't even imagine yet. He couldn't wait to see what was out there. The Red Force was nothing like Luffy remembered. Oh, the ship looked the same. Massive red hull cutting through the waves, skull and crossbones snapping in the wind, that familiar creak of wood and rope that had haunted his dreams for 8 years. But being on her as a crew member instead of a visiting kid changed everything. For one thing, she was loud, constantly loud. Pirates shouting orders, rigging groaning under sail changes, cannons being cleaned and checked, boots thundering across the deck at all hours. Luffy had grown up in a village where the loudest sound was usually Mayor Whoop Slap complaining about something. For another, she never stopped moving. Even in calm seas, there was this constant roll and pitch that made Luffy's stomach do things stomachs weren't supposed to do. He'd thought he was past seasickness. He'd been fishing his whole life, after all. Turned out there was a big difference between a rowboat in the harbor and a ship in open ocean. You're green as seaweed, kid, Lucky Roo observed, wandering over with a drumstick in one hand and a mug of ale in the other. Want some food? Nothing settles the stomach like a good piece of... No. Luffy practically dove for the rail, hanging his head over the side. No food, no mentions of food, no thinking about food. Usually works for me. Luffy would have glared at him, but that required lifting his head, and lifting his head required moving, and moving made everything worse. 3 days out from Fuchsia Village, and he still felt like his insides were doing some kind of horrible dance. It'll pass, Ben Beckman said, appearing beside them with his ever-present cigarette. Took Shanks a week to find his sea legs when we first started sailing. Course, he was only 12. I'm not 12, Luffy mumbled into the wind. No, you're 15 and acting like it. Come on, let's get you away from the rail before you fall overboard. Beckman hauled him upright with surprising gentleness. The first mate had been different since the incident at Fuchsia Village, not unfriendly, exactly, but watchful. Like he was seeing Luffy for the first time. Where's Shanks? Luffy asked, looking around the deck. The captain had been scarce since they'd left port, always busy with charts or crew meetings or mysterious pirate business. Having a very long conversation with Yasopp about responsibility and consequences, Beckman said dryly. Turns out recruiting a 15-year-old has some complications we didn't think through. Before Luffy could ask what that meant, Shanks himself appeared from the captain's cabin, looking tired. His usual grin was missing, replaced by something more serious. "Luffy, good you're up, we need to talk." That didn't sound promising. Luffy followed Shanks to a quieter part of the deck, near the figurehead where the wind was less brutal. "Having second thoughts?" Shanks asked without preamble. "What? No," the answer came out faster than Luffy had intended. "I mean, it's different than I thought it would be, harder, but I'm not giving up." "Good. Because it's about to get a lot harder." Shanks leaned against the rail, staring out at the horizon. "I've been thinking about what happened back in the village, that conqueror's hockey burst of yours. What about it?" It was completely untrained. Raw potential with no control whatsoever. If you'd been angry instead of protective, you might have knocked out everyone in the village, including the people you were trying to save. Luffy's stomach, which had finally started to settle, dropped again. I didn't know, I didn't mean to. I know you didn't, that's the problem." Shanks turned to face him fully. "Power without control is just destruction waiting to happen. And you've got more raw power than anyone your age should have. So teach me," Luffy said. "That's why I'm here, right? To learn." Shanks smiled, but it wasn't entirely happy. "That's part of it. But first you need to understand what you've signed up for. This isn't a game, Luffy. This isn't playing pirates in your village harbor. Out here, mistakes get people killed. Hesitation gets people killed. Being weak gets people killed." As if summoned by his words, a shout came from the crow's nest. Marine ship off the starboard bow, flying Lieutenant Commander colors, the deck exploded into activity. Pirates ran to battle stations, cannons were loaded, weapons were drawn. In seconds, the Red Force transformed from a sailing ship into a war machine. "Perfect timing," Shanks muttered. "Luffy, stay close to me and do exactly what I say. This is going to be your first lesson." The Marine ship was smaller than the Red Force but looked newer, sleeker. Her sails snapped taut as she changed course to intercept them. Through the spray, Luffy could see figures moving on her deck, dozens of white uniforms, gleaming weapons. "Red hair pirates," a voice boomed across the water, amplified by some kind of speaking device. "This is Lieutenant Commander Storm Fist Reginald. Surrender immediately." "Storm Fist," Lucky Roo laughed. "What kind of stupid name is that?" "The kind that usually means devil fruit powers," Beckman said grimly. "Everyone stay sharp." The Marine ship was closing fast, too fast for a normal sailing vessel. "Wind powers," Shanks observed. "He's using his devil fruit to boost their speed." "Clever, are we going to fight them?" Luffy asked and hated how young he sounded. "Depends. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you run, sometimes you negotiate. A good pirate knows which is which." Shanks cupped his hands around his mouth. "Lieutenant Commander, what's the charge?" "Piracy, murder, theft, corruption of minors, and resisting arrest," came the shouted reply. "Corruption of minors," Yasopp snorted. "That's a new one." "They mean me," Luffy realized. "They think you kidnapped me or something." "Did we?" Shanks asked with a slight grin. "I'm starting to wonder myself." The Marine ship was close enough now that Luffy could see individual faces. The man at the bow was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with arms like tree trunks and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. When he raised his hands, the wind around both ships suddenly picked up. "Last warning, Red Hair, surrender the boy and we might let some of your crew live." "Counteroffer," Shanks called back cheerfully. "Turn around now and we won't sink you." Storm Fist's response was to thrust both hands forward. The wind hit the Red Force like a physical blow, sending her heeling over to port. Pirates grabbed rigging to keep from being thrown overboard. Luffy slammed into the mast hard enough to see stars. "So much for negotiation," Beckman drawled, steadying his rifle. "Orders, Captain. Disable their sails, but don't kill anyone unless they force it. We're not murderers, no matter what they think." The battle started fast and brutal. Storm Fist could control wind in ways that seemed impossible, creating focused gusts that knocked pirates flat, generating whirlwinds that deflected bullets, even pulling the air from around his enemies to leave them gasping. But Shanks' crew had been fighting together for years. They moved like dancers, covering each other's weaknesses, setting up combinations that turned the Marine's strength against him. Yasopp's bullets curved around wind barriers to find their targets. Lucky Roo used the shifting winds to propel himself faster than any man his size should move. Beckman calculated angles and trajectories that let him ricochet shots off the water to hit Marines behind cover. And in the middle of it all, Luffy stood frozen. He wanted to help, desperately wanted to prove he belonged here, that Shanks had made the right choice bringing him. But every time he started forward, someone would shout a warning about incoming attacks, or the deck would shift under his feet, or he'd see just how fast and brutal everything was happening. This wasn't like the Marine attack in Fuchsia Village. Those had been regular soldiers, caught off guard, overwhelmed by his unexpected power. These were experienced fighters who knew what they were doing. Storm Fist alone was stronger than anyone Luffy had ever seen except Shanks himself. "Kid," Yasopp's voice cracked like a whip. "Duck!" Luffy threw himself flat as a concentrated blast of wind screamed over his head, strong enough to snap rigging lines. When he looked up, Storm Fist was standing at the edge of the Marine ship, staring directly at him. "So you're the brat they're all talking about," the Marine called. "The one with Conqueror's hockey. You don't look like much." "Leave him alone," Shanks snarled, moving to intercept, but Storm Fist was already in motion. The Marine leaped the gap between ships, wind propelling him like a cannonball. He landed on the Red Force's deck with a crash that splintered wood, then straightened to his full intimidating height. "Fight me, boy," he commanded. "Show me this legendary power that has Marine headquarters so worried." Luffy scrambled to his feet, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The Marine was between him and Shanks, between him and any possible escape. His voice came out as a squeak. He cleared his throat, tried again. "I don't want to fight you. Too bad." Storm Fist raised his hands, and suddenly Luffy couldn't breathe. The air around him turned solid, pressing in from all sides like invisible walls. "They say you knocked out 150 Marines. Let's see if it was just a fluke." Panic flooded Luffy's system. He clawed at his throat, trying to draw breath that wouldn't come. His vision started to blur around the edges. Somewhere far away, he could hear Shanks shouting, but the sound seemed to come through water. Do something, he told himself desperately. Use that power, the Conqueror's hockey, just like before, but nothing happened. Whatever he'd tapped into at Fuchsia Village was gone, buried under fear and inexperience and the crushing realization that he was completely, utterly out of his depth. Storm Fist smiled coldly. Pathetic. Marine headquarters was worried about this. You're just a scared little boy playing dress-up. The words hit harder than any physical blow, because they were true, weren't they? He was just a village kid who'd gotten lucky once. What had he been thinking, believing he could sail with the Red Hair Pirates? What had Shanks been thinking, bringing him along? The pressure around him increased. His knees buckled. Black spots danced in his vision. Then suddenly he could breathe again. Storm Fist went flying backward, slammed into the mast by what looked like an invisible fist. Shanks stood where the Marine had been, his own hand extended, face darker than a storm cloud. "Nobody," Shanks said quietly, "touches my crew." What followed wasn't a fight, it was a demonstration. Storm Fist was strong, experienced, had a powerful devil fruit ability. None of it mattered. Shanks moved like poetry, like violence given perfect form. Every attack the Marine threw was countered, every defense was shattered, every desperate gambit was turned against him. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. When it was over, Storm Fist lay unconscious on the deck, his ship's crew staring in shock at their defeated commander. The wind that had been howling around both vessels died to a whisper. "Take your man and go," Shanks called to the Marines. "And spread the word, the Red Hair Pirates don't start fights, but we sure as hell finish them." The Marines retreated, dragging their unconscious commander with them. Their ship limped away, sails torn, dignity in shambles. The Red Force's crew started cleaning up the damage, but Luffy couldn't move. He sat against the mast where he'd fallen, staring at his hands, replaying every moment of his complete and utter failure. "Rough first battle," Yasopp said, sitting down beside him. The sniper's usual cheerful demeanor was subdued. "I remember mine. Got so scared I forgot which end of my rifle the bullets came out of." "You're just saying that to make me feel better." "Nope. Asked Shanks to drop me off at the next island. Told him I wasn't cut out for pirate life." Yasopp pulled out a worn photograph, a woman with kind eyes and a small boy who looked just like him. "Know what changed my mind?" Luffy shook his head. "Realized that being scared was normal, being weak was normal, but giving up meant I'd never get strong enough to make my dreams come true. Never get strong enough to come back home as the man I wanted to be." "But you left your family," Luffy said. "Left your son. How is that not giving up?" Yasopp was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph. "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't staying. Sometimes it's leaving everything you love to become someone worthy of that love." He tucked the picture away and stood up. "You'll get there, kid. We all will. But first, you've got to stop thinking you should already be there." Luffy watched him walk away, then looked up to find Shanks approaching. The captain's expression was unreadable. "Well," Shanks said, settling cross-legged on the deck. "That could have gone better." "I failed," Luffy said flatly. "Completely, I couldn't do anything, I just froze." "Yep, I'm not strong enough, I'm not ready, maybe you should take me back to Luffy. Shanks' voice cut through his spiraling self-doubt. Let me tell you something about strength. Real strength isn't about never falling down, it's about getting back up every time you do. But you couldn't even what? Use a power you've never been trained to control in a situation you've never experienced against an enemy you've never faced. Shanks laughed, but it wasn't mocking. Kid, if you could do all that already, what would you need us for? Luffy looked up, confused. You think any of us were born knowing how to fight? You think Lucky Roo came out of the womb spinning like a top? You think Beckman was calculating bullet trajectories in his cradle? Well, no buts. We all started somewhere, and that somewhere was usually getting our asses kicked by people stronger than us. Shanks stood up, extending his hand. The question isn't whether you're strong enough right now. The question is whether you're willing to get strong enough eventually. Luffy stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Behind Shanks, he could see the crew working to repair battle damage, talking and laughing like getting attacked by Marines was just another day at the office. Which he was starting to realize it probably was. Being Pirate King, Shanks said quietly, isn't about being the strongest person on the ocean. It's about being strong enough to carry everyone's dreams, your crew's dreams. The dreams of everyone counting on you to succeed. How do you carry something that heavy? Same way you carry anything heavy, one step at a time, until you're strong enough to run with it. Luffy took Shanks' hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. His legs were shaky, but they held. So what now? He asked. Shanks grinned, and for the first time since leaving Fuchsia Village, it looked completely genuine. Now we start your real training. Hope you're ready to get your ass kicked a lot more before you start kicking ass yourself. Looking around at the crew, his crew now, he was starting to understand. Luffy felt something settle in his chest. Not confidence, exactly. He was still scared, still weak, still completely out of his depth, but he was ready to get stronger. Bring it on, he said, and meant it. The Red Force sailed on toward the Grand Line, carrying dreams and determination and one very seasick village boy who was slowly learning what it meant to be a pirate. The real adventure was just beginning. 2 months at sea had changed Luffy in ways he was still discovering. His sea legs had finally found themselves somewhere around week 3. His hands were harder now, calloused from endless rope work and weapons training. His reflexes were sharper, honed by daily sparring sessions where getting knocked on his ass was considered educational. But the biggest change was in how he saw the world. The Grand Line wasn't like East Blue. Here, islands floated in the sky or burned with eternal flames. Sea kings the size of mountains breached near their ship like they were saying hello. The weather could change from calm to hurricane in minutes, and the compass spun like a drunken dancer because apparently magnetic fields were more like polite suggestions out here. It was incredible and terrifying and nothing like the adventure stories he'd grown up hearing. Right now, though, it was mostly just loud. Sabaody Archipelago rose from the ocean like a fever dream, massive mangrove trees whose roots formed islands, their branches disappearing into clouds above. The air shimmered with soap bubbles that floated up from the roots, catching sunlight and painting everything in rainbow colors, and it was absolutely packed with people. Stay close, Ben Beckman warned as they walked down the gangplank. Sabaody's got a reputation for separating fools from their money and their lives. Luffy tried to stay close, he really did, but there was so much to see. Street performers juggling fire while riding unicycles. Food vendors selling things that smelled amazing and looked impossible. Musicians playing songs in languages he'd never heard. And pirates everywhere. This is Grove 13, Shanks explained, noting Luffy's wide-eyed staring. The lawless area, Marines don't patrol here, which makes it popular with our kind. Why don't Marines come here? Officially, insufficient resources. Unofficially, because the world nobles sometimes visit Grove 1 and the Marines would rather focus their protection there than deal with small-time pirates. World nobles, Shanks' expression darkened. Celestial dragons, the so-called descendants of the creators of the world government. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. They consider themselves above normal laws. Above normal people. Something in his tone made Luffy pay attention. Shanks got angry sometimes, at storms that threatened his crew, at Marines who fought dirty, at anyone who hurt innocent people. But this was different, colder. What do? Whatever they want, Yasopp said, joining the conversation. Buy and sell people like livestock, kill anyone who doesn't bow fast enough, turn entire countries into their personal playgrounds. And nobody stops them. Who's gonna stop them? Lucky Roo asked. They've got admiral protection wherever they go. You raise a hand against a world noble, the Marines send their strongest fighters to make you disappear. Luffy was quiet for a long moment, processing this. That's not right. No, Shanks agreed. It's not, but righteous anger without power only creates more suffering. Remember that, Luffy. Sometimes the hardest part of being strong is knowing when not to use that strength. They made their way deeper into the grove, past taverns where pirates sang drinking songs and markets where vendors hawked everything from devil fruits to wanted posters. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like, but there was an undercurrent of tension. These weren't just tourists having a good time, these were dangerous people in a dangerous place, all pretending to play nice. Captain Red Hair, the voice came from their left. An old man sat at a small table outside a tavern, a bottle of rum in front of him, and a smile that somehow managed to be both welcoming and intimidating. Luffy's first impression was that the man looked ordinary. Average height, graying hair, simple clothes. Then he looked closer and noticed the scars crisscrossing every visible piece of skin. The way the man sat perfectly balanced despite clearly being drunk. The fact that his presence made every other person in the immediate area give him plenty of space. "Silver's Rayleigh," Shanks said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "Didn't expect to find you here. Where else would an old pirate go to drink away his memories?" Rayleigh raised his bottle in a mock toast. "Besides, I heard through the grapevine that you'd picked up an interesting new crew member." His eyes fixed on Luffy, and suddenly it felt like being studied by a hawk. Not hostile exactly, but absolutely focused. "So you're the boy with Conqueror's hockey," Rayleigh continued. "Monkey D. Luffy, if the rumors are correct. You know my name, I know your grandfather's reputation. Vice Admiral Garp the Fist, now there's a man who knows how to throw a punch." Rayleigh's smile turned slightly predatory. "I also knew your father, though he went by a different title when we met." Luffy blinked. "My father. But I don't have a..." "Of course you do, boy. Everyone has a father. Whether they claim each other is another matter entirely." Rayleigh took a long drink, then fixed Luffy with another one of those penetrating stares. "Tell me, what do you know about the Pirate King?" "He found the One Piece," Luffy said immediately. "He was the freest man on the ocean. He could do whatever he wanted." "Could he now?" Rayleigh's tone was mild, but something about it made Luffy feel like he'd given the wrong answer to an important question. "Sit down, both of you. Let me tell you about Gall D. Roger." They found seats at the small table. Shanks looked relaxed, but Luffy noticed his hand never strayed far from his sword hilt. Even here, even with an old friend, he stayed ready. "Roger," Rayleigh began, "was the most selfish man I ever knew, and the most selfless. He'd steal food from Marines to feed hungry kids, then turn around and destroy entire fleets because they annoyed him." "That sounds contradictory," Luffy said. "Most people are contradictory if you look close enough, but Roger lived by his own rules, and those rules didn't always make sense to the rest of us." Rayleigh refilled his bottle from seemingly nowhere, then continued. "He could have lived forever, you know. We had the best doctors, the most advanced medical knowledge. When we found out about his illness, there were options." "What kind of illness?" "The kind that kills you slowly, stealing pieces until there's nothing left but pain." Rayleigh's voice went quiet. "But Roger chose to die his own way, on his own terms. He disbanded the crew, turned himself into the Marines, and made his death mean something. By starting the great age of pirates," Shanks said softly. "By giving hope to everyone who'd ever dreamed of freedom." Rayleigh looked directly at Luffy. "Do you know what he said to me the day we found the One Piece?" Luffy shook his head. He laughed. Just stood there laughing like it was the funniest joke in the world. Said we were too early, that someone would come along eventually who could finish what we started. Rayleigh's eyes never left Luffy's face. "Someone who inherited the will, not just the dream. What's the difference? Dreams are personal, will is something you carry for others." Rayleigh leaned forward. "Show me your Conqueror's hockey, boy. I can't control it yet. It just happens when I'm scared or angry or then get angry." Before Luffy could ask what he meant, a commotion erupted from deeper in the grove. Shouting voices, the crack of whips, the sound of people running. Then cutting through it all, a voice that made Luffy's blood run cold. "Lot 16, a mermaid only 20 years old. Bidding starts at 5 million berries. Slave auction," Rayleigh said matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. "Happens every day. The world government pretends it's illegal while taking a cut of the profits." Luffy stood up so fast his chair fell over. "There's a slave auction happening right now, with mermaids." "Sit down," Shanks said quietly. "But they're selling people, we have to." "We have to what?" Shanks' voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath. "Storm in there and free everyone. Fight the Marines who will show up. Start a war on an island full of civilians." "Yes," The word exploded out of Luffy before he could stop it. If people are being sold like things, then yes, we fight. And after we win. After we free everyone and escape and feel good about ourselves. Shanks stood as well, and suddenly he seemed much larger than usual. What happens to the slaves we couldn't save? What happens when the world government decides to make an example of this place? What happens to all the innocent people who get caught in the crossfire? Luffy opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He didn't have an answer. This is what I was trying to tell you, Shanks continued. Power without wisdom is just destruction. Good intentions don't make the consequences disappear. So we just do nothing. Luffy's voice cracked on the last word. We just let it happen. Sometimes, Rayleigh said gently, the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing. That's the burden of power, boy. Every choice has a cost. But Luffy wasn't listening anymore. The sounds from the auction house were getting louder. Cheers when bids went up, cruel laughter at the slaves' fear, the auctioneer's voice describing human beings like livestock. And underneath it all, he could hear something else. Crying. Quiet, hopeless sobbing that reminded him of the way Makino had cried when she thought no one was looking, back when the mountain bandits had threatened the village. Heat built in his chest. Not anger, exactly, something deeper than that. Something that felt like the ocean itself, vast and unstoppable and absolutely certain about what was right. Luffy, Shanks said warningly, but it was too late. Stop! The word came out carrying everything Luffy felt, his rage at the injustice, his grief for the people being sold, his absolute refusal to let this continue even 1 second longer. It rolled across Sabaody like thunder, like the voice of the sea itself. In the auction house, every single person collapsed except the slaves. The silence that followed was deafening. Well, Rayleigh said after a long moment, that's one way to handle it. Luffy swayed on his feet, suddenly exhausted. Using Conqueror's Haki deliberately was different from the unconscious burst back at Fuchsia Village. This had taken something out of him, left him feeling hollow. The slaves, he managed to say, are free, Shanks confirmed, and his voice was strange. Along with every criminal, bounty hunter, and world government agent who was in that building. Do you have any idea what you just did? The right thing? Shanks stared at him for a long moment, then started to laugh. Not the cruel laughter they'd heard from the auction house, but something warm and genuine and maybe a little amazed. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, you did the right thing. Stupid, reckless, going to cause us all kinds of problems, but right. The Marines will be here soon, Rayleigh observed. Probably admirals once word gets back to headquarters. You've just declared war on the world government's slave trade. Good, Luffy said, and was surprised by how much he meant it. Rayleigh studied him with those sharp eyes, then nodded slowly. Roger would have liked you, boy. He had the same problem with thinking things through. He stood up, suddenly looking much less like a harmless drunk. Come on, if we're doing this, we might as well do it properly. You're helping us. Someone needs to teach you how to use that power of yours before you accidentally level an island. Rayleigh grinned, and for a moment Luffy could see the legendary pirate he'd once been. Besides, it's been boring lately. A war with the world government sounds like fun. Shanks clapped Luffy on the shoulder. You realize there's no going back from this, right? After today, you're not just a crew member, you're a symbol. Every slave who dreams of freedom, every person who's been crushed by the world government, they're going to look at you as hope. Luffy thought about that, about the weight of other people's dreams. It should have been terrifying. Maybe it was terrifying. But looking around at Shanks, at Rayleigh, at the crew members who'd started gathering around them with determined expressions, he found he didn't care about the fear. Let them look, he said. I'll give them something worth seeing. In the distance, marine ships appeared on the horizon. Dozens of them, flying admiral flags, racing towards Sabaody like a white-sailed storm. The real war was about to begin. And somehow, Luffy couldn't wait. The marine fleet looked impressive from a distance. 20 ships arranged in perfect formation, admiral flags snapping in the wind, cannons gleaming in the afternoon sun. Up close, though, Luffy could see the tension on their faces. These weren't the confident soldiers who'd attacked Fuchsia Village. These were men who knew they were sailing toward something that could go very, very wrong. That's Admiral Kizaru's flagship, Ben Beckman observed, lowering his spyglass. And those are Vice Admiral ships flanking it. They're not taking any chances. Luffy squinted at the approaching vessels. Are we going to fight all of them? Not if we're smart about it, Shanks replied. He seemed completely calm, like facing down an admiral was just another Tuesday. Rayleigh, how rusty are you feeling? The old pirate cracked his knuckles, and suddenly the air around him felt heavier. Rusty enough to make this interesting. Shall we give them a demonstration? What happened next would have been impossible to follow if Luffy hadn't spent 2 months learning to see beyond normal human speed. Shanks and Rayleigh moved simultaneously, not toward the Marine fleet, but toward each other. Their weapons met in the space between them with a sound like the world breaking. The shockwave that followed was visible. It rippled outward from where they stood, turning the air itself into something you could see. When it hit the ocean, the water parted in a perfect circle around Sabaody, creating walls of sea that rose 50 feet high. When it hit the Marine fleet, every single ship stopped dead in the water. Conqueror's hockey, Shanks explained conversationally, as if he wasn't currently locked in a blade struggle with one of the most legendary pirates who ever lived. When two users of sufficient strength clash, reality tends to take notice. The water walls collapsed back into the ocean with a roar that shook the entire archipelago. In the sudden calm that followed, a voice drifted across the water, amplified by some kind of device. "Red Hair, we're not here to fight you." Shanks and Rayleigh separated, their demonstration complete. The old pirate was breathing slightly hard, but Shanks looked like he could do it all day. "Then what are you here for, Kizaru?" Shanks called back. A figure appeared on the lead Marine ship's bow, tall, thin, wearing the distinctive coat of an admiral. Even from this distance, Luffy could feel the man's presence like weight pressing down on his shoulders. "The boy," Kizaru's voice carried easily across the water. "The one who destroyed the auction house. Hand him over and we'll forget this little incident ever happened." "Counteroffer," Shanks replied cheerfully. "Turn around and sail away and I won't sink your entire fleet." The standoff stretched taut. 20 Marine ships, hundreds of soldiers, an admiral who could move at the speed of light. Against one Yonko, one retired legend, and a crew of maybe 30 pirates. It should have been suicide to refuse. Instead, after what felt like forever, the Marine ships began to turn around. "This isn't over, Red Hair," Kizaru called as his fleet retreated. "The boy has made enemies of the world government. We'll be watching, they always are," Shanks muttered, then raised his voice again. "Give my regards to Sengoku." Luffy watched the Marine fleet disappear over the horizon, hardly believing what he'd just witnessed. They just left. "All of them, politics," Rayleigh explained, settling back into his chair and reaching for his bottle. Kizaru could probably fight Shanks to a draw, maybe even win if he got lucky. But it would cost him most of his fleet and all of his men. The world government doesn't like those kinds of casualties over one escaped slave auction. "Besides," Shanks added, "they got what they really wanted. Now they know for certain that you're with us. Word's going to spread that red-haired Shanks has taken Monkey D. Luffy under his wing. Is that bad? Depends on who's listening." Shanks' expression grew serious. "Some people are going to see it as a threat, others as an opportunity, and a few," he trailed off, looking out at the horizon with an expression Luffy couldn't read. "A few what? A few are going to see it as a challenge." As if summoned by his words, a new shape appeared on the horizon. Not a ship this time, something much larger. As it came closer, Luffy realized it was an island, an actual floating island moving across the ocean under its own power. "Oh hell," Yasopp breathed. "That's the Queen Mama Chanter." The floating island settled into the water a few hundred yards away, and Luffy got his first good look at it. Candy-colored buildings rose from what looked like cake frosting, spinning lollipop trees swayed in an unfelt breeze, and creatures straight out of fairy tales wandered the streets. It should have been whimsical, magical. Instead, it was absolutely terrifying. Because standing at the edge of the island, glaring across the water with eyes like burning coals, was the largest human being Luffy had ever seen. Charlotte Linlin. Big Mom, one of the 4 emperors of the sea. She was massive in a way that made Storm Fist look like a child. 20 feet tall at least, with pink hair that moved like it was alive and a face that managed to be both motherly and demonic. When she opened her mouth to speak, her voice carried the kind of authority that made mountains bow. "Red Hair," the words hit like physical blows. "What did you do to my auction house?" "Your auction house?" Shanks called back, and Luffy noticed his crew had unconsciously arranged themselves for battle. "Since when do you own Sabaody's slave trade, Linlin?" "Since I bought controlling interest last month. That was 300 million berries worth of merchandise you just liberated. Someone owes me compensation." Big Mom pointed directly at Luffy, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach. "That boy, the one with Conqueror's hockey, he did this." "The boy's under my protection," Shanks said quietly, but his voice carried across the water like he was standing right next to her. "Your protection?" Big Mom's laugh was like breaking glass mixed with children's screams. "A 15-year-old brat destroys my property, and you think your protection means anything to me?" She raised one enormous hand, and suddenly the air around Sabaody began to change. The cheerful bubbles that gave the archipelago its character started popping, one by one, each burst sounding like a small explosion. The candy-colored buildings on her ship began to glow with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. "Mama's getting angry," someone whispered from Big Mom's crew. Even at this distance, Luffy could hear the fear in the voice. "Soul power," Rayleigh observed clinically. "She can manipulate the souls of everything around her. Those bubbles, the buildings, even the water itself, to her, they're all alive and ready to serve." Big Mom gestured, and the ocean between the two ships began to rise. Not like the walls Shanks and Rayleigh had created, this was different. The water moved like it was alive, forming shapes that looked almost human. Giant figures made of seawater, each one as tall as the Red Force's mainmast. "Last chance, Red Hair," Big Mom called. "Give me the boy or I take him." Luffy's heart was hammering so hard he could barely hear over the sound of his own pulse. This wasn't like facing Storm Fist or even Admiral Kizaru. This was something beyond his comprehension, a force of nature that happened to look like a person. "Shanks," he started to say, but the red-haired captain cut him off with a gesture. "You want him," Shanks called back to Big Mom. "Come and take him." What followed wasn't a battle. It was a collision between forces that shouldn't exist in the same world. Big Mom moved first, leaping from her ship to land on the water's surface like it was solid ground. The ocean around her feet turned black, then red, then colors Luffy didn't have names for. Her homies, the living objects that served her, swarmed across the water like a candy-colored tide of destruction. Shanks met her halfway. Luffy had seen Shanks fight before, had watched him take apart Storm Fist like the Marine was moving through molasses, had seen him demonstrate techniques that seemed to bend reality around them. None of it had prepared him for this. Shanks moved like lightning given form, like violence distilled to its purest essence. Every step sent shockwaves through the water. Every swing of his sword cut through Big Mom's attacks like they were made of paper. When their weapons finally met, Big Mom's enormous blade Napoleon against Shanks' smaller but infinitely sharper sword, the sound was like the world ending. The sky split above them. Literally split, like someone had drawn a line from horizon to horizon and torn the heavens in half. Clouds scattered in every direction. The ocean beneath them turned white with foam from the pressure of their clash. And they were just getting started. "This is insane," Lucky Roo said, voicing what everyone was thinking. They're going to sink the entire archipelago, but they weren't just trading blows anymore. They were talking, their voices somehow carrying clearly despite the chaos around them. "You've gotten soft, Red Hair," Big Mom snarled, pressing forward with an attack that would have leveled buildings. "Protecting some brat instead of minding your own business." "Maybe," Shanks admitted, deflecting the strike and countering with one of his own. "Or maybe I just remember what it's like to believe in something. Belief is for children and fools. Then I guess I'm both." Their battle raged across the water, neither giving ground, neither showing any sign of tiring. But Luffy was starting to notice something. Big Mom was stronger, her attacks hit harder, her presence was more overwhelming, her devil fruit powers gave her advantages Shanks couldn't match. But Shanks was smarter. Every exchange seemed random at first, but gradually Luffy began to see the pattern. Shanks wasn't trying to overpower Big Mom, he was maneuvering her, guiding their fight toward a specific area of ocean. Away from Sabaody, away from both crews, away from anything that could be damaged by their clash. More than that, he was studying her, learning her rhythm, her tells, the tiny hesitations that preceded her strongest attacks. Big Mom fought like a force of nature, all overwhelming power and fury. Shanks fought like a chess master, thinking 3 moves ahead. He's not going to win by being stronger, Luffy realized out loud. No, Ben Beckman agreed. But he might win by being better. The battle reached its crescendo when Big Mom summoned what looked like a miniature sun. The orb of burning plasma hovered over her head, radiating heat that turned the ocean around her to steam. "Burn everything," she screamed, hurling the artificial star directly at Shanks. Instead of dodging, Shanks did something that made Luffy's eyes water to watch. He gathered every bit of haki he possessed, armament to strengthen his blade, observation to see the perfect angle, conquerors to impose his will on reality itself, and cut the miniature sun in half. The 2 pieces flew past him harmlessly, splashing into the ocean where they hissed and steamed before going out. Big Mom stared at him in shock. "Impossible. Nothing's impossible," Shanks said calmly. "You just have to want it badly enough." For a moment, it looked like Big Mom might attack again. Her face cycled through expressions, rage, disbelief, calculation. Then unexpectedly, she began to laugh. "Mama, mama. Oh, Red Hair, you always did know how to put on a show." She lowered her weapon, though she kept it ready. The boy stays with you then, for now. Generous of you. Don't mistake this for mercy. Big Mom's eyes fixed on Luffy again, and he felt like a mouse being stared at by a particularly hungry cat. I'm curious about him now. A 15-year-old with Conqueror's hockey strong enough to knock out an entire auction house. That's not normal talent, that's something special. She pointed directly at him. Listen well, boy. You can hide behind Red Hair's protection for now, but eventually you'll have to stand on your own. When that day comes, you'll have a choice: join my family or become my enemy. There won't be a third option. I already made my choice, Luffy called back, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. I'm going to be Pirate King. Big Mom's laughter this time was genuinely delighted. Mama, mama, Pirate King. You, a skinny little brat who can barely control his own power. Yeah, Luffy said simply. Me. Something in his tone made her laughter fade. She studied him with those burning eyes, and Luffy felt like she was looking right through him, seeing things he didn't even know were there. Interesting, she murmured. Very interesting indeed. The Queen Mama chanter began to move, lifting slowly out of the water until it was floating again. Big Mom stood at its edge, still watching Luffy. Remember my words, Monkey D. Luffy, she called as her ship sailed away. You'll be mine eventually, one way or another. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Everyone on the Red Force seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see if the nightmare was really over. Finally, Shanks swam back to the ship and hauled himself over the rail. He was soaked, exhausted, and had a dozen new cuts that hadn't been there before the battle, but he was grinning. Well, he said, wringing water from his hair. That was invigorating. Captain, Yasopp said carefully, did you just pick a fight with Big Mom over a kid who's been with us for 2 months? Yep, and now she's declared him a future enemy of one of the most powerful pirate crews in the world. Yep, and you think this was a good idea because… Shanks looked at Luffy, who was still staring at the spot where Big Mom's ship had disappeared. Because sometimes you have to take a stand. Sometimes you have to look at someone and say, this person matters enough to fight for. He clapped Luffy on the shoulder. Besides, did you see the look in his eyes when he told her he was going to be Pirate King? Kid believed every word of it. Luffy did believe it. That was the strange part. Watching Shanks fight Big Mom, seeing the sheer impossible scale of power they both wielded, should have made his dream seem ridiculous. He was 15 years old, barely able to control his haki, couldn't even take down a single Marine lieutenant commander. But somehow, watching that battle had made him more certain than ever. Someday, he was going to be that strong. Someday, he was going to stand where Shanks had stood and face down monsters like Big Mom without flinching. Someday, he was going to be Pirate King, and if that meant making enemies of emperors, well, he'd just have to get strong enough to handle it. Shanks, he said quietly. Yeah, thank you, for protecting me, for believing in me. Shanks smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the man who'd saved a 7-year-old boy from a sea king all those years ago. Don't thank me yet, kid. After today, the real work starts. Every emperor in the New World just got word that red-haired Shanks is training a successor. They're all going to want to test you, challenge you, maybe try to kill you before you become a threat. Let them come, Luffy said, and meant it. The Red Force sailed away from Sabaody as the sun set, carrying dreams and determination, and one very determined boy who was starting to understand what it really meant to reach for the impossible. The Grand Line stretched ahead of them, vast and dangerous and full of wonders. Luffy couldn't wait to see what came next. 2 years later, the sword came at Luffy's head faster than most people could see. 2 years ago, it would have taken his ear off. Now, he ducked under it without breaking stride, grabbed his attacker's wrist, and used their momentum to flip them over his shoulder. Ben Beckman hit the deck hard but rolled with the impact, already bringing his backup weapon, a wickedly sharp knife, toward Luffy's ribs. Luffy's hand turned black with armament haki. The knife shattered against his palm like it was made of glass. Better, Beckman admitted, climbing to his feet and brushing dust off his coat. 6 months ago, you would have tried to dodge the knife too. You're finally learning when to tank damage and when to avoid it. Around them, the rest of the Red Hair Pirates had stopped their own training to watch. This had become a daily ritual over the past few months, Luffy challenging Beckman to increasingly serious sparring matches, each one pushing him a little further than the last. Again, Luffy said, settling into a fighting stance that looked nothing like the wild swinging he'd started with 2 years ago. His posture was balanced now, economical, designed to generate maximum power with minimum wasted motion. Kid's getting cocky, Lucky Roo observed to Yasopp. Think he's actually ready to take on Ben for real? Look at his eyes, Yasopp replied quietly. Does that look like cockiness to you? It didn't. Luffy's expression was calm, focused. carrying the kind of confidence that came from 2 years of having his ass kicked by some of the strongest fighters on the ocean. He'd learned to read opponents, to think 3 moves ahead, to use his devil fruit powers in ways that would have seemed impossible when he first joined the crew. Most importantly, he'd learned to lose, because he had lost. A lot. Beckman had beaten him 247 times in the past 6 months. Luffy kept count not out of masochism, but because each loss taught him something new about himself, about fighting, about what it meant to be strong. Today felt different though. Today he thought he might actually have a chance. "Ready?" Beckman asked, drawing his main sword again. The first mate had stopped holding back weeks ago, treating these spars like real battles. It was the only way Luffy would improve fast enough to survive what was coming. "Ready?" They moved simultaneously. The fight that followed would have been impossible to track for anyone who hadn't spent 2 years watching Luffy grow. He flowed between attacks like water, using his rubber powers not just for stretching punches, but for absorbing impacts, redirecting force, moving in ways that shouldn't have been physically possible. But the real difference was in how he thought. When Beckman feinted left and attacked right, Luffy was already moving to counter the real attack. When the first mate tried to use superior reach to keep him at distance, Luffy collapsed that distance in ways that turned Beckman's advantages into weaknesses. Every exchange showed the tactical awareness that Shanks had been drilling into him, not just how to fight, but when and why and what the consequences would be. The spar ended when Luffy's fist, coated in advanced armament hockey and moving faster than cannon fire, stopped exactly 1 inch from Beckman's throat. The deck was silent for a long moment. "Well," Beckman said finally, lowering his sword, "took you long enough." Luffy stepped back, suddenly grinning. "Does this mean I win? It means you're finally ready to start the real training." "That wasn't real training, kid," Beckman said, lighting a fresh cigarette with hands that were completely steady despite having just fought for his life. "That was just teaching you not to embarrass yourself. Now we find out if you've got what it takes to be a Yonko's successor." The celebration that night was subdued by red hair pirate standards. No massive drinking contest, no singing that could be heard 3 islands away. Just the crew gathered around the deck, sharing stories and watching Luffy try to process what had just happened. "So what now?" he asked Shanks, who was sitting cross-legged near the bow, staring out at the stars. "Now we start the final phase of your education," Shanks replied. "You've learned to fight like a pirate. Time to learn to think like a Yonko. What's the difference? A pirate fights for treasure, for glory, for the thrill of it. A Yonko fights to protect something bigger than themselves." Shanks gestured at the crew around them. "Every decision I make affects not just me, but every person who's chosen to follow me, every territory under my protection, every alliance I've made or enemy I've created." Luffy was quiet for a moment, thinking about that. "Is that why you let me come with you? Because you saw something bigger than just another crew member?" "Partly," Shanks smiled. "Also because you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who changed the world just by refusing to accept that it couldn't be changed." Before Luffy could ask who he meant, Yasopp approached with a newspaper in his hand and an expression Luffy had never seen before. "Captain," the sniper said quietly, "you need to see this." Shanks took the paper and his expression darkened as he read. Finally, he handed it to Luffy without comment. The headline made his stomach drop: "East Blue's Demon." Roronoa Zoro claims 5th bounty hunter title. Below it was a picture that looked like it had been taken in the middle of a battlefield. Zoro stood surrounded by defeated pirates, 3 swords gleaming in his hands, a new scar across his left eye that definitely hadn't been there 2 years ago. He looked older, harder, like he'd been forged in fire and come out as steel. The article was brief but disturbing. Zoro had apparently been working with Dracul Mihawk not as a student but as a partner. Together, they'd been hunting down pirates across East Blue and the first half of the Grand Line, claiming bounties and building a reputation that had Marine headquarters taking notice. "Mihawk's teaching him," Shanks observed. "Question is, what's he teaching him to do?" Luffy read further, his heart sinking with each paragraph. According to the report, Zoro had refused multiple invitations to join pirate crews, including some significant names. He was working alone except for his partnership with Mihawk, turning down offers of friendship or alliance in favor of cold professionalism. "He's not the same person," Luffy said softly. "None of them are," Yasopp replied, producing more newspapers from his coat. "Look at these." The next paper showed a headline about cat burglar Nami, who'd apparently become the most successful independent navigator in the Grand Line. She worked for whoever paid best, switching sides without warning, stealing from pirates and Marines alike. The accompanying picture showed her standing on the deck of what looked like a high-tech ship, surrounded by navigation equipment that probably cost more than most pirate crews' entire treasure hoards. Another paper featured Usopp, except they were calling him Soge King now. He'd become some kind of mysterious vigilante in East Blue, appearing wherever civilians needed protection, then vanishing without a trace. The Marines had put a bounty on him, but no one even knew his real name. The last paper was about Sanji, and it actually made Luffy smile a little. He was still at the Bar-80, but he'd become famous in his own right, not just as a cook, but as Blackleg Sanji, a fighter who could take down Marine officers with nothing but kicks. Restaurant customers came as much to watch him fight as to eat his food. They all made their own choices, Shanks said gently. Found their own paths, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But they're not, Luffy struggled to find the words. They're not the people I thought they'd become. People become who they need to become to survive, Beckman observed, joining the conversation. Your friends didn't have a Yonko's crew to protect them while they grew up. They had to get strong fast, and that changes a person. Luffy stared at the pictures of his would-have-been crewmates. In another timeline, another world, these people would have been his closest friends. They would have sailed together, fought together, chased the same impossible dream. Instead, they were strangers who happened to share his past. Do you regret it? Shanks asked quietly. Coming with us instead of finding them? It was the question Luffy had been avoiding for 2 years. The one that woke him up sometimes in the middle of the night, wondering what would have happened if he'd made different choices. No, he said finally, and was surprised by how certain he sounded. I mean, I wish things could have been different for them, but no, I don't regret this. He gestured around the ship at the crew that had become his family. You gave me something I never would have found on my own, not just strength, but perspective, I guess, understanding of what it really means to be responsible for other people's dreams. And them, Shanks nodded toward the newspapers. They'll find their own way to their dreams. Maybe someday our paths will cross again, and maybe we can be allies instead of just whatever we are now. That's very mature of you, Beckman noted. Don't get used to it, Luffy grinned. I'm still planning to punch a bunch of world nobles in the face eventually. The crew laughed, the tension breaking like a wave against rocks. But later, when everyone else had gone to sleep, Luffy found himself standing at the rail, staring out at the endless ocean and thinking about roads not taken. Somewhere out there, Zoro was becoming a legendary bounty hunter. Nami was building her own empire of information and navigation services. Usopp was protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Sanji was cooking food that brought joy to everyone who tasted it. They were all following their dreams, just in ways Luffy had never imagined. Maybe that was okay. Maybe it was even better than what he'd originally pictured. They were free to become whoever they wanted to be, without being limited by his vision of what they should be. And he was free to become someone he'd never imagined he could be, not just a pirate captain leading a small crew, but a potential Yonko who could change the shape of the world itself. Second thoughts, Shanks appeared beside him as quiet as a shadow. Third or fourth thoughts actually, Luffy admitted, but the conclusion's the same. Good, because tomorrow we start preparing for the next phase. Which is, Shanks smiled, and in the moonlight he looked like the legend he'd become. Tomorrow, we start getting you ready to meet the other emperors as an equal instead of a protege, which means you're going to learn what it feels like to fight someone who's actually trying to kill you. Luffy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Who? Kaido's been making noise about wanting to test Whitebeard's strength before the old man gets too sick to fight. Whitebeard's crew has been asking for allies. Shanks' expression grew serious. War's coming, Luffy. The kind that reshapes the world. And when it does, you're going to need to be ready to stand in the center of it without flinching. The weight of that settled over them like fog. In the distance, Luffy could see lights from other ships. Merchant vessels, probably, carrying people who had no idea that the fate of the world might be decided by the choices a 15-year-old boy made in the next few months. Are you ready for that? Shanks asked. Luffy thought about Zoro's new scars, about Nami's cold professionalism, about all the ways the world had changed while he was learning to be strong enough to change it back. Ask me again in a few months, he said. But deep down, looking at the vast ocean that stretched toward infinite possibilities, he thought he might be. The Grand Line had made him stronger. Now it was time to find out if it had made him strong enough. Sabaody Archipelago looked exactly the same as it had 2 years ago. Same bubble-coated mangrove trees stretching toward the clouds, same rainbow shimmer in the air, same mixture of pirates and civilians creating a carnival atmosphere that barely concealed the underlying danger. But Luffy felt completely different walking through it. 2 years ago, he'd been overwhelmed by everything: the crowds, the smells, the sheer impossibility of a place where islands grew on trees. Now he moved through the chaos like he belonged here, reading the subtle signs that marked territory boundaries, identifying which groups were allies and which were looking for trouble, automatically cataloging escape routes and defensive positions. "You've gotten paranoid," Yasopp observed, noting how Luffy's eyes never stopped moving. "I've gotten smart," Luffy corrected. "There's a difference." They were back in Grove 13, the lawless area where pirates gathered to resupply and trade information. The Red Force was docked at the same pier they'd used before, but this time no one was bothering them. Word had spread about what happened last time, both with the slave auction and with Big Mom. Most of the smaller crews were giving them plenty of space. Most, but not all. Well, a voice drawled from across the marketplace. "Look what washed up on our shores." Luffy turned to see a figure that looked like he'd stepped out of a nightmare. Spiky red hair, pale skin covered in scars, arms that ended in metal prosthetics that looked more like weapons than hands. Eustace, Captain Kidd, with a bounty of 315 million berries and a reputation for casual violence that made most pirates nervous. Behind him stood his crew, a collection of killers and madmen who looked like they'd crawled out of the worst parts of the Grand Line. Killer with his spinning blades and masked face. Heat with his blue hair and ability to breathe fire. Wire with his trident and cold eyes. "Kid," Shanks said calmly, appearing beside Luffy with that casual way of moving that suggested he'd been ready for this confrontation from the moment they'd docked. "Heard you've been making a name for yourself." 315 million, Kid replied, tapping the bounty poster pinned to a nearby wall. "Highest in the worst generation. Not bad for someone who doesn't hide behind a Yonko's protection." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Around them, other pirates started backing away, sensing the potential for violence. Street vendors began packing up their goods with practiced efficiency. "Careful," Ben Beckman warned quietly, his hand resting on his rifle. "Kid's not someone you want to underestimate." But Luffy was studying the other captain with interest rather than anger. Kid was strong, that much was obvious from the way he moved, the confidence in his posture, the casual way his crew deferred to his authority. He was also angry, carrying the kind of rage that came from fighting the world alone and winning through sheer brutality. "You want to fight me," Luffy said. "It wasn't a question. I want to see if Red Hair's little protege is worth the reputation he's been building," Kid replied. "Word is you've got Conqueror's hockey. Word is you took out an entire slave auction by yourself. Word is Big Mom herself declared you a future threat. Word travels fast. Word travels far when it's interesting enough." Kid's metal arm shifted, revealing blades and spikes that looked like they could punch through steel. "So what's it gonna be, Straw Hat? You gonna hide behind your captain, or are you gonna prove you deserve that bounty of yours?" Luffy blinked. "I have a bounty." Yasopp pulled out a newspaper and handed it to him wordlessly. There, on the front page, was his own face above the headline, "Monkey D. Luffy, 400 million berry bounty for destruction of world government property." The picture looked like it had been taken during the slave auction incident. Luffy stood in the center of the destroyed building, unconscious Marines scattered around him like leaves, expression fierce with protective fury. 400 million, he said, genuinely surprised. "That seems like a lot." "It's the highest starting bounty in recorded history," Shanks said dryly. "Congratulations, you're officially more dangerous than most veteran pirates." Kid's expression darkened. 400 million for one incident, while I've been fighting Marines and rival crews across half the Grand Line for 3 years. "Maybe you're just not as impressive as you think you are," Luffy said mildly. The marketplace went dead silent. Kid's Conqueror's hockey hit like a physical blow, washing over the grove in a wave of pure killing intent. Weaker pirates collapsed immediately. Even some of the stronger ones staggered, overwhelmed by the sheer malevolence behind the attack. Luffy's own Conqueror's hockey rose to meet it. The collision was like watching two storms crash into each other. Where Kid's presence was all rage and destruction, Luffy's carried something different, not anger but absolute certainty. The kind of will that moved mountains not by forcing them, but by refusing to accept that they couldn't be moved. For a moment, the two forces were perfectly balanced. Then, slowly, Luffy's hockey began to push back. Kid's eyes widened in shock as his own power was steadily overwhelmed. The unconscious pirates around them began to stir as the pressure of his presence faded, replaced by something that felt less like a threat and more like hope. "Impossible," Kid breathed. Nothing's impossible, Luffy said, echoing Shanks' words from 2 years ago. You just have to want it badly enough. That settles it. Kid's metal arm transformed, blades extending and rotating until it looked like a mechanical buzzsaw. Fight me right here, right now. Kid, Shanks said warningly. This isn't your fight, Red Hair, Kid snapped. This is between me and your boy, unless you think he can't handle himself. Shanks looked at Luffy, who nodded slightly. After a moment, the Yonko stepped back. Don't level the grove, he said calmly. There are civilians here. I'll try to keep the property damage to a minimum, Luffy replied, settling into a fighting stance. What followed was unlike anything the grove had seen in years. Kid fought like a force of nature, using his magnetic powers to turn every piece of metal in the area into a weapon. Swords flew through the air like guided missiles. Cannons twisted themselves into impossible shapes before launching themselves at Luffy's head. Even the nails in the wooden buildings tried to tear themselves free to join Kid's arsenal. But Luffy had spent 2 years learning to fight people who could reshape reality on a whim. He flowed around Kid's attacks like water, using his rubber powers not just for offense but for defense, absorption, redirection. When a barrage of swords came at him from 6 different directions, he stretched his arms to catch them all, then snapped back like a slingshot to hurl them back with twice their original force. Gomu Gomu no, Luffy's fist turned black with armament haki as he wound up for a devastating punch. Jet Gatling, the barrage of haki-coated punches came too fast to count, each one capable of punching through steel. Kid barely managed to get a wall of scrap metal up in time, but even that crumpled under the assault. Kid retaliated by magnetizing every weapon in the grove simultaneously, creating a tornado of spinning blades that should have turned Luffy into confetti. Instead, Luffy did something that made several people gasp. He turned his entire body black with armament haki and walked straight through the tornado. Blades shattered against his skin like they were hitting diamond. When he emerged on the other side, completely unharmed, Kid's expression shifted from confidence to something approaching respect. Full-body armament, Kid muttered. How the hell did you learn that? Practice, Luffy said simply. Lots and lots of practice. The fight continued for another 10 minutes, both combatants pushing themselves to their limits. Kid revealed techniques Luffy had never seen, magnetic fields that could crush bones, polarized attacks that ignored conventional defenses, the ability to turn his own body into a living weapon of metal and magnetism. But Luffy had tricks of his own. Gear Second, which he could now maintain indefinitely without strain. Gear Third, which no longer left him shrunk and vulnerable afterward. And glimpses of something beyond both, techniques he was still developing, powers that Shanks had hinted at but not yet taught him to fully control. In the end, it was strategy rather than strength that decided the outcome. Kid was powerful, but he fought like someone who'd always won through overwhelming force. Luffy fought like someone who'd learned to think 3 moves ahead, to turn his opponent's strengths into weaknesses. When Kid committed everything to one final, devastating magnetic assault, pulling metal from across half the grove to create a construct the size of a small building, Luffy was ready for him. Gomu Gomu no, Luffy's entire arm turned black as he wound up for what looked like the punch of his lifetime. Red Hawk, the technique combined everything he'd learned, Gear Second speed, advanced armament haki's penetrating power, and something new that made his fist actually catch fire as it moved through the air. When it connected with Kid's metal construct, the result was spectacular. The entire assemblage of twisted metal exploded outward like a bomb going off. Kid went flying, crashing through 2 buildings before finally coming to rest in a pile of rubble. The grove was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, Kid pulled himself out of the debris. He was battered, bleeding, probably had a concussion, but he was grinning. Now that, he said, spitting blood, was a real fight. You're not angry about losing? Luffy asked, genuinely curious. Hell no, I'm angry it took this long to find someone worth fighting. Kid limped over, extending his non-metal hand. Eustace Kid, captain of the Kid Pirates. Monkey D. Luffy, Luffy replied, shaking the offered hand. Successor to the Red Hair Pirates, I guess. That was impressive, a new voice said from the edge of the crowd. Both of you. Everyone turned to see a tall, thin figure in a spotted hat and long coat. Trafalgar Law, the Surgeon of Death, with his Nadachi across his shoulder and an expression that gave nothing away. Law, Kid said warily, didn't expect to see you here. I go where the interesting people are, Law replied smoothly. His eyes fixed on Luffy, and you, Straw Hat, are very interesting indeed. Thanks, I think. I have a proposition for you, Law continued. An alliance. The word sent murmurs through the crowd. Alliances between pirate crews were serious business, not something entered into lightly. What kind of alliance? Shanks asked, moving to stand beside Luffy. The kind that could take down a Yonko, Law said simply. The grove went dead silent again. Which Yonko? Luffy asked. Does it matter? Pick one. They're all monsters who have grown too comfortable with their power. Law's smile was sharp as a scalpel. But with the right strategy, the right allies, even monsters can fall. You're talking about war, Beckman observed. I'm talking about change, Law corrected. The current system is stagnant. 4 emperors dividing up the new world between them, the world government content to let them maintain the status quo as long as they don't get too ambitious. Nothing ever changes, nothing ever grows. And you think we can change that? Luffy asked. I think you're going to change it whether you plan to or not, Law said. The question is whether you do it smart or whether you do it the hard way. Before Luffy could respond, shouts erupted from the harbor. Marine ships, dozens of them, were surrounding the grove, moving with the precision that suggested careful planning rather than random patrol. Admiral Kizaru, someone screamed. It's Admiral Kizaru, the crowd scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Pirates ran for their ships, civilians dove for cover, vendors abandoned their stalls in favor of not being vaporized by a marine admiral. Through the chaos, a figure appeared in the center of the grove as if he'd materialized from light itself. Tall, thin, wearing the distinctive coat of a marine admiral, Kizaru looked around with an expression of mild interest. My, he said in a voice like honey over broken glass. So many dangerous criminals in one place, how convenient. His eyes settled on Luffy. Monkey D. Luffy, 400 million berries. The Marines have been very interested in meeting you. The feeling's not mutual, Luffy replied, settling into a fighting stance. Oh, I'm not here to arrest you, Kizaru said casually. I'm here to test you. See if you're worth the reputation you've been building. Light began to gather around his fingertips, condensing into beams that could punch through steel. Let's see if Red Hair's successor can protect his crew when it really matters. Luffy looked around at the Red Hair pirates, at Kid and his crew, at Law who was watching everything with calculating eyes. All of them strong, all of them dangerous, but not necessarily strong enough to face an admiral and walk away. For the first time since joining Shanks' crew, he was going to have to fight not just for victory, but for the lives of everyone counting on him. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Bring it on, he said, and meant every word. Kizaru smiled, and the grove filled with light bright enough to blind. The real test was about to begin. The news hit the red force like a cannonball to the gut. Luffy stared at the newspaper in his hands, reading the headline over and over as if the words might change. Fire Fist Ace captured execution set 4 Marineford. The picture below showed Ace in Seaston shackles, kneeling on the execution platform where Gall D. Roger had died 22 years ago. Even in chains, even facing death, he looked defiant. That familiar crooked grin was still there, like he was sharing a joke with the world that only he understood. Luffy. Shanks' voice was gentle, the way it got when he was about to deliver news that would hurt. I know what you're thinking, but we have to save him. The words came out flat, certain, carrying no room for argument. Ace is my brother. Brother? Ben Beckman looked up from his own copy of the paper. I thought you were an only child. Not by blood, by choice. Luffy's hands were trembling slightly, the newspaper crinkling under his grip. We swore an oath when we were kids, sake cups and everything. Ace, me, and... He paused, remembering another face from long ago, and someone else. Yasopp shifted uncomfortably. Kid, you know what you're asking. Marineford isn't just any marine base, it's their headquarters. The fleet admiral will be there, all 3 admirals, every vice admiral they can muster. It'll be the strongest force the world government can assemble. I know. And Ace isn't just any pirate, Shanks added quietly. He's Whitebeard's division commander. The old man's not going to let his son die without a fight. Good. That means we won't be fighting alone. Luffy. Shanks moved to stand directly in front of him, forcing eye contact. Think about what you're saying. You want the Red Hair pirates to go to war with the world government to save someone who chose to follow a different Yonko. Yes. You want to risk the lives of every person on this ship for a brother you haven't seen in over 2 years. Yes. You want to potentially start a conflict that could reshape the entire balance of power in the world. If that's what it takes. Luffy's voice was getting stronger. More certain with each word. Ace would do it for me. Hell, Ace probably will do it for me someday when I inevitably do something stupid enough to get captured. Shanks studied his face for a long moment. And if I say no? If I decide the risk is too great, the cost too high? The question hung in the air like smoke. Around them, the crew had gone silent, understanding that they were witnessing something important. A moment that would define not just Luffy's future, but his relationship with the man who'd been more of a father to him than anyone else. "Then I'll go alone," Luffy said simply. "You'd leave the crew. Leave everything we've built together. I'd hate it, but yes, if I had to." Luffy's eyes never wavered from Shanks. "Some things are more important than being smart or safe or practical. Some things you do because they're right even if they're impossible." Silence stretched between them, then slowly Shanks began to smile. "You know," he said conversationally, "that's exactly the kind of stupid, selfless, utterly impossible thing your brother would say." "My. What?" Instead of answering directly, Shanks pulled out a den mushi that had been ringing quietly in the background. The voice that crackled through the speaker was aged but unmistakably powerful. "Red hair. I was wondering when you'd call." "Whitebeard," Shanks replied, his tone respectful despite their rivalry. "I suppose you've seen the news. My son is going to die unless I do something about it." The old Yonko's voice carried the weight of mountains. "The Marines think they can use him as bait to draw me into a trap. They're probably right." "Probably. Question is, what are you planning to do about it? What do you think?" "I'm going to tear Marineford apart stone by stone until I find him." A pause, "But I hear you have a personal interest in this matter as well." Shanks glanced at Luffy, who was listening with growing confusion. "You could say that. The boy doesn't know, does he?" "Know what?" Luffy demanded. "What are you two talking about?" Whitebeard's laughter rumbled through the den mushi like distant thunder. "Tell him, Red Hair. He has a right to know before he charges into hell for family he doesn't even recognize." Shanks was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "Luffy, there's something about Port Gazdiace that you need to understand. Something the Marines are about to announce to the world that's going to make this war about more than just saving one pirate." "What?" "Ace isn't just Whitebeard's division commander. He's not just your sworn brother." Shanks' expression was serious, almost sad. "He's Gul D. Rogers' son." The words hit Luffy like a physical blow. He actually staggered, reaching out to steady himself against the mast. "That's impossible. Roger died 22 years ago. Ace is only 20. "Roger had a lover," Shanks said gently. "Port Gazdi Rouge. She kept Ace in her womb for 20 months, long enough for the Marines to stop looking for Roger's child. It killed her, but she saved his life." "You knew," Luffy's voice was barely a whisper. "All this time you knew Ace was." "I suspected. The timing was right, and Ace had Roger's reckless streak, his unwillingness to back down from a fight even when he should." Shanks smiled sadly. "Plus, he had the same stubborn loyalty that made Roger turn himself in rather than let his crew suffer for his choices." Through the den mushi, Whitebeard's voice cut through Luffy's reeling thoughts. "The Marines are going to announce it at the execution. Make it clear that they're not just killing a pirate, but wiping out Roger's bloodline entirely. They want to make a statement about what happens to the children of pirate kings." The implications hit Luffy like successive waves. Ace was Roger's son. The world government was using him as a symbol, and when they announced his parentage to the world, "They're going to come after me next," he realized. "After you taught me, after I inherited your will, they'll see me as Roger's spiritual successor. Two birds with one stone." "Very good," Whitebeard rumbled approvingly. "The boy thinks like a strategist." "He's been learning," Shanks said proudly, but his expression remained troubled. "Luffy, you understand what this means. This isn't just about saving Ace anymore. This is about the world government trying to eliminate Roger's legacy entirely. If we go to Marineford, we're declaring war on everything they stand for." Luffy was quiet for a long time, processing everything he'd just learned. Ace was Roger's son. The Pirate King had had a family, had left someone behind when he chose to die for his ideals. And now that someone was going to die unless Luffy did something about it. "The red hair pirates follow me," he said finally. "Yes, my decisions affect everyone on this crew. Yes, and if I choose wrong, people I care about could die. That's the weight of command," Shanks agreed. "The burden every leader carries." Luffy looked around at the crew, his family for the past 2 years. Lucky Roo, who'd taught him that strength could be gentle. Yasopp, who'd shown him what it meant to sacrifice for your dreams. Ben Beckman, who'd beaten tactical thinking into his skull one sparring match at a time. All of them watching him, waiting for his decision. Ready to follow wherever he led, even if it meant sailing straight into hell. "We go," he said firmly. "We save Ace and we show the world government that Rogers didn't die with him." "Even knowing the cost?" Shanks asked. "Especially knowing the cost." Luffy's hand moved unconsciously to the straw hat on his head, feeling the familiar weight of inherited dreams. Someone once told me that being Pirate King isn't about being the strongest person on the ocean. It's about being strong enough to carry everyone's dreams. He looked directly at Shanks. Roger's dream, Ace's dream, your dream. The dreams of everyone who's ever believed that things could be better than they are. If I can't carry those to Marineford, what right do I have to call myself your successor? Shanks' smile was radiant. None at all. Which is exactly why you're going to make one hell of a Pirate King someday. He turned to address the crew. You heard him, boys. Change course for Marineford. We've got a war to fight. The crew exploded into activity, but it wasn't the chaotic scrambling Luffy had expected. This was practiced, professional, the response of people who'd been preparing for something like this their entire careers. Within minutes, the Red Force was cutting through the waves at full speed, racing toward what might be the greatest battle in pirate history. Red hair, Whitebeard's voice crackled through the Den Mushi again. I appreciate the support, but this is my fight. Ace is my son. And Luffy is mine, Shanks replied without hesitation. Not by blood, but by choice. Just like you and Ace. Two Yonko crews against Marine headquarters. Think that'll be enough? Shanks looked at Luffy, who was standing at the bow, staring toward their destination with absolute determination. It'll have to be, he said, but privately he wondered if even that would be sufficient. The world government had been planning this for months, maybe years. They wouldn't have moved against Ace unless they were confident they could handle whatever response came. Still, they'd never faced anything quite like this before. Two Yonko crews working together, united by bonds of family and shared conviction. A war fought not for territory or treasure, but for the simple principle that some things were worth dying for. As Marineford grew larger on the horizon, its fortress walls gleaming white in the afternoon sun, Shanks found himself thinking about Roger. About the choices his former captain had made, the legacy he'd left behind, the way his death had changed the world. Soon, they'd find out if that legacy was strong enough to save his son. Prepare for battle, Ben Beckman's voice rang across the deck. All hands, prepare for battle. The final war of the old era was about to begin. And at its center, wearing a straw hat that had once belonged to a pirate king, stood a young man who carried the dreams of generations on his shoulders. Win or lose, the world would never be the same. Marineford looked like the end of the world. The marine fortress rose from the sea like a mountain of white stone and steel, bristling with cannons that could level cities. The bay was packed with warships, more than Luffy had ever seen in one place, arranged in perfect formation like pieces on a chessboard. Between them, the water itself seemed to glow with the reflection of thousands upon thousands of marines, each one armed and ready to die for their version of justice. Impressive, Ben Beckman observed, lowering his spyglass. They've assembled damn near their entire military force. Look at the platform, Shanks said grimly. In the center of the fortress, raised high enough for everyone to see, stood the execution platform. Even from this distance, Luffy could make out three figures, Ace kneeling in the center, flanked by two executioners with massive blades. His brother looked small up there, dwarfed by the enormity of the fortress around him. But even bound and facing death, Ace held his head high, defiant to the end. We're not too late, Luffy breathed. No, a voice rumbled from behind them. We're right on time. The Moby Dick had appeared as if from nowhere, emerging from a coating bubble that had hidden it beneath the surface. And standing at its bow, looking like a force of nature given human form, was Edward Newgate. Even at 72, even visibly ill, Whitebeard was the most intimidating person Luffy had ever seen. 21 feet tall, muscles that could crush buildings, and a presence that made the air itself feel heavier. His famous Bicento gleamed in the sunlight, and when he planted its butt on the deck of his ship, the sound echoed across the entire bay. Ace, Whitebeard's voice carried easily across the water. My son, are you prepared to come home? From the execution platform, Ace's voice cracked as he shouted back, Pops, I told you not to come. This is my fault. I should have listened when you told me not to chase Blackbeard. A father doesn't abandon his children, Whitebeard replied simply. No matter what mistakes they've made. Fleet Admiral Sengoku appeared on the fortress walls, his voice amplified by speakers placed throughout the bay. Edward Newgate, you're too late. In 10 minutes, Port Gazdiace dies, and with him, the bloodline of the most evil man in history. Tell them, Whitebeard said, and his words somehow carried over Sengoku's announcement. Tell them who that boy really is. Sengoku's expression was grim, but he continued. Citizens of the world, Marines, pirates, hear the truth that has been hidden for 20 years. The man you know as Port Gazdiace is not merely a pirate. He is the son of Gall D. Roger, the Pirate King, The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. Then the bay exploded into chaos. Marines who had seemed confident moments before began to look nervous. Pirates throughout the assembled fleets started shouting questions, demands, curses. The civilians watching from safe distances screamed in terror or amazement. But Luffy only had eyes for Ace, who had gone perfectly still on the execution platform. 20 years ago, Sengoku continued, Rouge of Batarilla Island sacrificed her life to hide this child from justice. She kept him in her womb for 20 months, dying so that Roger's bloodline could survive. Today, we correct that mistake. Like hell you do, Luffy snarled, and before anyone could stop him, he launched himself from the red force toward the bay. Luffy, Shanks shouted, but it was too late. What followed was unlike anything in the history of naval warfare. Luffy hit the water moving faster than most people could see, using gear second to rocket toward the fortress. Behind him, both Yonko crews erupted into action, but he was already too far ahead to stop. The first line of marine ships tried to intercept him. Luffy went through them like they were made of paper, his hockey-coated fists punching holes through hull plating, his rubber powers letting him bounce from ship to ship faster than their cannons could track. "Stop him," Admiral Akainu's voice boomed across the bay. "Don't let him reach the platform." But Luffy had spent 2 years learning to fight impossible odds. When a squad of vice admirals moved to block his path, he flowed around them like water, using their own attacks against each other. When pacifistas fired their laser beams, he was already somewhere else, leaving only afterimages. He was halfway to the fortress when something hit him like a falling mountain. Admiral Aokiji stood on a pillar of ice that had formed under his feet, his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. "Ice Age," he said calmly, and the entire bay began to freeze. The water turned solid in seconds, trapping ships in place, creating a battlefield where armies could clash directly. But more importantly for Luffy, it gave the Marines a stable platform to attack from. "Straw Hat Luffy," Aokiji continued, ice forming around his hands. "Son of Dragon, brother to Ace, student of Red Hair Shanks. The world government has been very interested in meeting you." "Then let's not keep them waiting," Luffy replied, and launched himself directly at the Admiral. The battle that followed shook the frozen bay. Ice and rubber, fire and cold, two different philosophies of justice clashing at superhuman speed. Aokiji was stronger, more experienced, had a devil fruit power that could flash freeze oceans. But Luffy had something the Admiral didn't expect. He fought like someone who had absolutely nothing to lose. Every punch carried the weight of 2 years' training. Every dodge flowed into a counterattack. Every technique built on lessons learned from fighting some of the strongest people on the ocean. When Aokiji tried to freeze him solid, Luffy's haki broke through the ice like it was glass. When the Admiral created weapons of pure cold, Luffy's rubber body absorbed the impacts and turned them into momentum for his next attack. Gomu Gomu no. Luffy's entire body turned black as he wound up for what looked like the punch of a lifetime. Jet Bazooka, the attack sent Aokiji flying, crashing through 3 ice walls before finally coming to rest in a crater of his own making. But before Luffy could press his advantage, another voice cut through the chaos. "Impressive, boy. But you're still too slow." Admiral Kizaru appeared in a flash of light, moving faster than human eyes could follow. His kick, traveling at light speed and coated in enough force to level buildings, should have taken Luffy's head clean off. Instead, it met a Bicento blade the size of a small tree. "Leave the boy alone," Whitebeard said calmly, having somehow crossed the entire battlefield without anyone noticing. "If you want to fight someone, fight me." What happened next was beyond description. Whitebeard and Kizaru, two forces of nature, trading blows that split the air and shattered the ice beneath their feet. Each exchange created shockwaves that knocked lesser fighters flat, light and earthquake power clashing in ways that hurt to witness directly. But Luffy wasn't watching. He was running again, using the distraction to close the distance to the execution platform. Past Marines who were too busy staring at the Admiral-level battle to notice one more pirate. Past defenses that had been designed to stop armies, not individuals willing to sacrifice everything for family. He was almost there when Ace's voice stopped him cold. "Luffy, is that really you?" For the first time since the battle started, Luffy looked up at the execution platform. Ace was staring down at him with an expression of complete shock, like he was seeing a ghost. "Hey Ace," Luffy called back, grinning despite everything. "Sorry I'm late." "You idiot, what are you doing here? This is suicide." "Same thing you'd do if our positions were reversed," Luffy replied, settling into a fighting stance as Marines began to surround him. "Coming to save my brother." For a moment, Ace's composure cracked. Tears streamed down his face as he struggled against his sea stone chains. "You stupid, I'm not worth this. I'm not worth all these people dying." "That's not for you to decide," Whitebeard said, appearing beside Luffy with his bicento dripping Admiral Kizaru's blood. "A man's worth isn't measured by his mistakes, but by the people willing to fight for him." The old Yonko looked down at Luffy, and there was something like approval in his eyes. "You've grown strong, boy, strong enough to stand beside me in battle." "I learned from the best," Luffy replied. "Then let's show these Marines what that means," Whitebeard said, and raised his weapon toward the execution platform. The earthquake that followed was visible. The air itself cracked like glass, reality bending under the force of Whitebeard's power. The execution platform, built to withstand any conventional assault, began to crumble. But the Marines had planned for this. "Sakazuki," Sengoku's voice boomed across the battlefield. Now, Admiral Akainu erupted from the fortress like a volcano given human form. Magma dripped from his fists as he moved, each step leaving molten footprints in the ice. His target wasn't Whitebeard, it was Luffy. Red Hair's protege, Akainu snarled as he closed the distance. Roger's spiritual successor. "The world government should have killed you years ago." His fist, coated in magma hot enough to melt steel, came at Luffy's head with the force of an erupting volcano. Luffy had fought admirals before. Had learned to match their speed, counter their techniques, hold his own against impossible odds. But Akainu was different. This wasn't just about power, this was personal. The admiral fought like someone who genuinely believed that killing Luffy would make the world a better place. In Ugami, Akainu's magma formed itself into the shape of a massive dog, jaws wide enough to swallow Luffy whole. "Die for your sins," Luffy dodged, but barely. The heat alone was enough to singe his clothes, and when the magma dog hit the ice behind him, it created a crater 20 feet deep. "Is this the best Red Hair could do?" Akainu taunted, pressing his attack. "A rubber boy who can't even protect himself, let alone change the world." "I don't need to change the world," Luffy replied, his voice steady despite the deadly situation. "I just need to save my brother." "Your brother is dead." Akainu's next attack came from 3 directions at once, magma fists that moved faster than cannon fire. Just like his father. "Just like you're about to be." That was when everything went wrong. Luffy saw the attack coming, was already moving to dodge, when he heard the sound that stopped his heart, the clink of breaking chains. Ace had somehow freed himself from the Seastone shackles, probably using a key stolen by one of Whitebeard's commanders during the chaos. He was falling from the platform, fire already wreathing his body as he prepared to join the battle. But he was falling directly into Akainu's path. "Ace!" Luffy screamed, changing direction mid-dodge to intercept. He wasn't fast enough. Akainu's magma fist punched through Ace's chest like it was made of paper. The fire that had always surrounded Luffy's brother flickered and went out, leaving only a young man with a hole where his heart should be. "No!" The word tore from Luffy's throat, carrying with it every ounce of grief and rage and desperate denial he possessed. Ace looked down at the wound in his chest, then up at Akainu with something that might have been surprise. "That actually hurts." "Magma burns hotter than fire," Akainu said coldly. "Your power was always inferior to mine." Ace collapsed, blood pooling beneath him on the ice, but somehow he was smiling. "Luffy," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos of battle, "I'm glad you came. Even if it was stupid." "Don't talk," Luffy said desperately, dropping to his knees beside his brother. "Save your strength. We'll get you to a doctor. We'll listen to me." Ace's hand, already growing cold, gripped Luffy's wrist with surprising strength. "I need you to understand something. Ace, please. I spent my whole life wondering if I deserved to exist, if the son of the Pirate King had any right to live in a world that hated his father." Ace's smile grew wider, even as his breathing grew shallower. "But seeing you here, seeing how many people came to save me, I finally have my answer." Tears were streaming down Luffy's face now, falling onto his brother's chest. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." "Thank you," Ace whispered, "for loving me, for making me feel like I was worth something." His eyes focused on something beyond Luffy and his smile became radiant. "Pops, I can see why you chose Luffy. He's going to be an incredible pirate king." "Ace," Luffy's voice cracked. "Ace, stay with me." But his brother was already gone, the light fading from his eyes like a dying flame. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. All around them, the battle continued, Marines fighting pirates, admirals clashing with commanders, the frozen bay running red with blood. But for Luffy, none of it existed. There was only Ace, still and cold in his arms. "One down," Akainu said with satisfaction. One to go. That was when something inside Luffy broke. The Conqueror's haki that erupted from him wasn't like anything he'd released before. This wasn't protective instinct or righteous anger, this was pure grief, distilled into a weapon that could reshape reality itself. Every marine within 100 yards collapsed instantly. The ice beneath them cracked and shattered. Even some of the stronger fighters, vice admirals, pirate commanders, seasoned veterans of countless battles, fell to their knees under the sheer weight of Luffy's anguish. Impossible, Akainu breathed, actually taking a step backward. This level of Conqueror's haki, from a child, but Whitebeard was watching with something like pride in his eyes. Not a child, he said quietly. A king, the real thing, finally awakened. The old Yonko stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Luffy's shoulder. Boy, look at me. Slowly, Luffy raised his head. His eyes were empty, hollow, like looking into an abyss. Your brother died protecting something he believed in, Whitebeard continued. Don't let that sacrifice be meaningless by drowning in grief. He's gone, Luffy whispered. Ace is gone and I couldn't save him. No, but you can save everyone else. Whitebeard gestured around them at the ongoing battle, at the pirates and marines dying for ideals they might not even understand. That's what it means to be a king, boy, to carry the weight of everyone's dreams, even when your own heart is breaking. Luffy looked around at the chaos, at the friends and enemies locked in desperate combat. At Shanks fighting 3 vice admirals simultaneously while trying to reach them. At the Whitebeard pirates dying by the dozen to rescue a brother they'd lost anyway. I don't know how, he said honestly. You'll learn, Whitebeard replied. Same way we all do, by making the hard choices and living with the consequences. The old man straightened to his full imposing height, Bicento gleaming in his hands. But first, we finish this. Together, what followed was the most devastating 15 minutes in marine history. Whitebeard and Luffy, the old king and the future one, fought side by side like they'd been partners their entire lives. Where Whitebeard's earthquakes shattered reality, Luffy's haki imposed a new one. Where Luffy's speed created openings, Whitebeard's power exploited them to devastating effect. They carved through the marine forces like reapers in a wheat field. Admirals fell back before their combined assault. Vice admirals who had never known fear learned what it meant to face absolute conviction, but the cost was terrible. Whitebeard was dying. Had been dying for months, maybe years, his body failing him even as his will remained unbroken. Each earthquake attack took something out of him, each step forward was paid for with blood he could no longer afford to lose. Pops, Luffy said during a brief lull in the fighting, seeing how the old man swayed on his feet. I'm fine, boy, Whitebeard replied, though blood was trickling from the corner of his mouth. Just getting old, you don't have to do this. We can retreat, regroup. No, Whitebeard's voice carried absolute finality. This ends here, one way or another. He looked out over the battlefield at his sons still fighting, still dying for the family he'd built. I won't let them sacrifice any more for my failures. Your failures? I let Ace chase Blackbeard alone. I let him get captured. The old Yonko's voice cracked slightly. I failed as a father. No, Luffy said firmly. You came here, you risked everything to save him. That's not failure, that's love. Whitebeard looked down at him, and for a moment his expression was incredibly gentle. You really are going to be an incredible king, aren't you? Before Luffy could respond, Akainu appeared behind them like a nightmare made manifest. Enough sentiment, the admiral snarled. Time to end this farce. His fist, superheated beyond imagination, punched toward Whitebeard's back. The old Yonko could have dodged, should have dodged. Instead, he turned just enough to take the blow on his side rather than his spine, protecting Luffy even as magma burned through his organs. Pops, Luffy screamed. World's strongest man, Akainu sneered as Whitebeard fell to one knee. You're just a sick old has-been. That was his mistake. Even dying, even with half his torso burned away, Edward Newgate was still the man who had fought on equal terms with Gall D. Roger. His Bicento, coated with enough earthquake power to split continents, caught Akainu across the chest and sent him flying so far he became a speck on the horizon. Remember, Whitebeard whispered to Luffy as he collapsed. A king protects his people no matter what it costs him. And then, impossibly, he smiled. The One Piece is real, tell the world that Edward Newgate said so. The strongest man in the world died standing up, his Bicento planted in the ice like a gravestone. The silence that followed his death was absolute. Marines, pirates, everyone who had witnessed the end of an era stood frozen in shock. It was Luffy who finally broke the silence. Enough, his conqueror's haki exploded outward again, but this time it was different. Not grief or rage, but something far more dangerous, absolute authority. The will of someone who had decided in that moment that he would reshape the world or die trying. Half the Marines in Marineford fell unconscious. The other half found themselves unable to move, pinned by the sheer force of Luffy's presence. "This war is over," he announced, his voice carrying across the entire fortress. "Anyone who wants to keep fighting can fight me." Fleet Admiral Sengoku stepped forward, his own presence formidable enough to resist Luffy's haki. "Stand down, Straw Hat. You're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. "Am I?" Luffy asked, and suddenly the bay filled with the sound of approaching ships. The Revolutionary Army had arrived, dozens of vessels flying Dragon's flag, carrying soldiers who had been waiting their entire lives for a chance to strike at the world government's heart. Behind them came more pirates, captains who had heard about the war and decided they wanted a piece of history, crews who owed favors to Whitebeard or Shanks, independent operators who just wanted to see the world burn. And at their head, moving through the chaos like he owned it, was Dragon himself. "Hello, son," the most wanted man in the world said calmly as he stepped onto the ice. "Heard you were starting a revolution without me." Luffy looked around at the forces arrayed on both sides, Marines and pirates and revolutionaries, all of them ready to die for their version of justice. At Ace's body, still and cold. At Whitebeard's massive form, frozen in death. At Shanks, who had fought his way across the entire battlefield and was now standing beside him with pride and sorrow warring on his face. "This isn't a revolution," he said finally. "This is a funeral for the old world." He picked up Ace's body, cradling his brother against his chest. "But when we bury it, we're going to make sure something better grows in its place." Fleet Admiral Sengoku looked at the forces arrayed against him, did the calculations, and made the only choice a smart commander could make. "All forces retreat," he ordered. "Fall back to the secondary positions." As the Marines withdrew, carrying their wounded and their dead, Luffy stood in the center of the battlefield holding his brother's body. Around him, the alliance he'd never meant to build, Red Hair pirates, Whitebeard pirates, Revolutionary Army, waited for his word. "What now?" Shanks asked quietly. Luffy looked up at him, and Shanks saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not innocence lost, that had died with Ace. Something harder, more dangerous. The look of someone who had learned that the world was cruel and unjust and had decided to do something about it. "Now," Luffy said, "we change everything." The war was over. But the revolution was just beginning. The Red Force sailed through waters stained red with blood. 3 days had passed since Marineford, and Luffy hadn't spoken a word to anyone. He sat at the bow, knees drawn up to his chest, staring at nothing. The straw hat hung loose around his neck. He hadn't worn it properly since the battle ended. Ace's body lay on the deck behind him, wrapped in Whitebeard's coat. They were sailing toward Dawn Island, toward the mountain where 3 boys had once sworn to become pirates together. It seemed like the right place for a funeral. "He needs to eat something," Makino's voice drifted from behind him. She'd insisted on coming when she heard what happened, taking the first ship from East Blue to meet them. "He needs to grieve," Shanks replied quietly. "Some things can't be rushed," but Luffy could hear the worry in his voice. Could feel the entire crew walking on eggshells around him like he might shatter if they spoke too loudly. Maybe they were right, maybe he would. The memories kept playing on repeat. Ace's smile as he died, Whitebeard's final words. The way Akainu had looked satisfied, like he'd just stepped on a particularly annoying bug. All those people who died because Luffy had decided to save his brother. Had it been worth it? All that death, all that destruction, just to hold Ace's hand while he slipped away. "Luffy," Shanks' voice was gentle as he sat down beside him. "Talk to me." "About what?" Luffy's voice came out hoarse from disuse. "About whatever's eating you alive." Luffy was quiet for a long time. Then finally, "How many people died because of me?" "That's not, how many," the words came out sharper than intended. "I counted, at least 300 pirates. Maybe twice that many Marines, all because I couldn't accept that sometimes you lose people." Shanks sighed. "Kid, that's not how it works." "Isn't it? I made the choice to go to Marineford. I convinced you to bring the crew. All those deaths are on my hands. And all those lives that were saved, the slaves we freed at Sabaody, the territories under our protection that stay peaceful because people know what happens when you threaten a Yonko's crew." Shanks turned to face him fully. "You think power only brings death, doesn't it?" Luffy gestured vaguely toward the stern where Ace's body waited. "Everyone I care about, everyone who gets close to me, they get hurt, they die. Maybe I'm just cursed. You sound like Roger." The words hit like a slap. Luffy finally looked at Shanks directly. "What?" After he found out about his illness, he went through the exact same thing. started questioning whether his choices had brought more suffering than joy, whether the world would be better off if he'd never been born. What changed his mind? Rayleigh asked him a simple question. If you could go back and choose differently, knowing everything you know now, would you? Luffy thought about that. About never meeting Shanks, never eating the devil fruit, never learning that the world was bigger than Fuchsia Village. About never joining the Red Hair Pirates, never learning hockey, never discovering what it meant to fight for something bigger than yourself. About never going to Marineford, never trying to save Ace. No, he said finally. I'd do it all again, even knowing the cost, especially knowing the cost. The words surprised him with their certainty. Ace died smiling because he knew people loved him enough to fight for him. Whitebeard died standing because he refused to let his sons face the world alone. Those deaths, they meant something. And the ones that didn't, the random Marines and pirates who died just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, that was harder to answer. Luffy was quiet for several minutes, thinking about faceless soldiers whose only crime had been following orders. I'll carry them, he said finally. All of them, their deaths, their families, their dreams that'll never come true. I'll carry them all and I'll make sure their sacrifice builds something better. Shanks smiled, and for the first time since Marineford, it looked genuine. Now you sound like a king. Before Luffy could respond, Lucky Roo's voice rang out from the crow's nest. Ship approaching, flying black sails. The mood on deck shifted instantly. Black sails usually meant one thing, someone looking for a fight. Can you see the flag? Ben Beckman called up. Yeah, but you're not gonna like it. It's Blackbeard. The name hit the deck like a cannonball. Even Luffy snapped to attention, suddenly alert for the first time in days. Marshal D. Teach, Shanks said grimly. Should have known he'd show up eventually. The Blackbeard pirate's ship was visible now, a massive vessel that looked like it had been cobbled together from the wrecks of dozens of other ships. At its bow stood a figure that made Luffy's blood run cold. Blackbeard was exactly as ugly as his reputation suggested. Missing teeth, wild black hair, a gut that spoke to too much drink and too little exercise. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, calculating. The eyes of someone who saw opportunity in every tragedy. Zehahaha, red hair, Blackbeard's voice carried easily across the water. Heard you had some excitement at Marineford. What do you want, Teach? Shanks called back, his hand moving unconsciously toward his sword. Just wanted to pay my respects to Fire Fist's little brother. Blackbeard's grin was horrible, showing the gaps where teeth used to be. Must be hard losing family like that. Especially when it was all for nothing. Luffy was on his feet before he realized he'd moved, fists clenched tight enough to draw blood from his palms. Easy, Shanks warned. That's exactly what he wants. But Blackbeard wasn't done. You know, it's funny, if Ace had just minded his own business, none of this would have happened. He'd still be alive, Whitebeard would still be the strongest man in the world, and hundreds of people wouldn't be feeding the fishes right now. Shut up, Luffy said quietly. What's that? Can't hear you over the sound of all that failure. Blackbeard cupped his hand to his ear in an exaggerated gesture. Oh wait, I know, you're probably wondering if this is your fault. If maybe you should have stayed in East Blue where you belonged. I said shut up. Zehahaha, hit a nerve, did I? Well, here's some free advice. Boy, power without control is just destruction. And from where I'm standing, you look like the most destructive thing on these waters. That was when Luffy snapped. He didn't remember jumping. Didn't remember activating Gear Second. Didn't remember coding his fist in armament hockey. One moment he was standing on the Red Force's deck. The next he was flying toward Blackbeard's ship with murder in his eyes. Luffy, no, Shanks shouted, but it was too late. Luffy's punch, carrying all his grief and rage and self-hatred, should have taken Blackbeard's head clean off. Instead, it disappeared into a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Zehahaha. The yami yami no mi, Blackbeard grinned as shadows wrapped around his body like armor. Darkness itself, and you know what darkness does to little lights like you. His counterattack hit like a freight train. Not just physical force, but something deeper, a pulling sensation that seemed to drag at Luffy's very soul. His devil fruit powers flickered and died, leaving him just a normal human being facing a monster. That's the beauty of darkness. Blackbeard continued his assault, each blow enhanced by the gravitational pull of his devil fruit. It doesn't matter how bright you think you are. Eventually, everything gets swallowed up. Luffy tried to fight back, but it was like trying to punch smoke. Every attack was absorbed by Blackbeard's darkness, every technique neutralized before it could land. Worse, he could feel his strength being drained away, pulled into the void that surrounded his opponent. This is what happens when little boys try to play in the big leagues. Blackbeard grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the deck. You want to know who's really responsible for Fire Fist's death? It's you. If you'd never gone to Marineford, the Marines would have just executed him quietly. But no, you had to make it into a war. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Because they were true, weren't they? If Luffy had stayed away, if he'd let Ace face his fate alone. All those deaths, Blackbeard continued, his grip tightening. All that suffering. All because one stupid boy couldn't accept that he wasn't strong enough to save everyone. You're right, Luffy whispered. What? You're right, I wasn't strong enough. Luffy looked up, and there was something different in his eyes. Not defeat, something harder. But I will be. His conqueror's haki exploded outward, not wild and unfocused like at Marineford, but precise, controlled, carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had found his resolve again. Blackbeard actually staggered, his darkness flickering under the assault. Impossible, Conqueror's haki doesn't work on darkness, doesn't it? Luffy's voice was calm now, centered. Darkness is just the absence of light. And I'm done hiding in the shadows. What followed was less a fight than a statement of intent. Luffy's haki burned through Blackbeard's darkness like sunlight through fog, each attack carrying the weight of absolute conviction. This wasn't about power anymore. This was about will, and Luffy's will had been forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the decision to never lose anyone again. Blackbeard fought desperately, using every trick his devil fruit allowed, but it was like trying to hold back the dawn. Luffy's presence filled the space between the two ships, pushing back the darkness, imposing order on chaos. The end came when Luffy's fist, coated in Conqueror's haki so intense it was visible, connected with Blackbeard's jaw. The impact sent the would-be emperor flying, crashing through his own ship's mast before disappearing into the ocean with a splash that could be heard from miles away. Zehaha, haha, Blackbeard's voice was weak as he surfaced, treading water. This isn't over, Straw Hat. The darkness will swallow everything, eventually. Maybe, Luffy replied, standing at the edge of the enemy's ship, but not today. He turned and walked back to the Red Force, leaving Blackbeard to be fished out of the ocean by his own crew. The silence that greeted his return was profound. Everyone, Shanks, Beckman, the entire crew, was staring at him like they'd never seen him before. What? He asked. Kid, Beckman said slowly, do you know what you just did? Punched an asshole who was talking trash about Ace. You dominated another Conqueror's haki user in single combat, Shanks said quietly. That's not something most people can do. Luffy thought about that. About the way his haki had felt different during the fight, more focused, more purposeful. Like it was finally his instead of just a power he happened to possess. Shanks, he said finally, I need to ask you something. Shoot. I want to leave. The words hung in the air like smoke. Around them, the crew went perfectly still. Leave, Shanks repeated carefully. You mean take some shore leave? Visit some friends? I mean leave the Red Hair Pirates, form my own crew. Luffy looked around at the people who'd been his family for the past 2 years. It's not that I don't love you all. It's that I need to find my own way to be strong. Luffy, Yasopp started, but Shanks held up a hand to stop him. Why? The red-haired captain asked simply. Because staying here is safe. Staying here means always having backup, always having someone stronger to fall back on when things get tough. Luffy gestured toward where Blackbeard's ship was disappearing over the horizon. I beat him today, but only because I finally stopped hiding behind your reputation and started fighting like myself. And you think you need to be alone to do that? Not alone, but independent. Leading instead of following, making my own mistakes instead of avoiding them because you're there to catch me. Luffy looked at Shanks directly. How long did you stay with Roger's crew? Shanks was quiet for a long moment. Until the day he disbanded us. And how long after that before you formed your own crew? About 6 months. There you go, Luffy smiled, and for the first time since Marineford, it reached his eyes. I'm not running away from you. I'm running toward something, the same thing you ran toward when you left Roger behind. Shanks studied his face for what felt like forever, then slowly he began to smile too. You know what the hardest part of being a captain is? He asked. What? Knowing when to let people go. Shanks reached up and took the straw hat from around Luffy's neck, settling it properly on his head. This belongs to someone who's going to be Pirate King someday. I think that someone is ready to start earning it. The hat felt different now, not like something borrowed, but like something inherited. Something that had been waiting for him to grow into it. Where will you go? Beckman asked. East Blue first, to bury Ace properly. After that, Luffy shrugged. Wherever the Grand Line takes me, I guess. And your crew, Luffy thought about that. About Zoro's new scars, about Nami's cold professionalism, about all the ways his old friends had changed. Maybe they were different now. Maybe they'd become people he wouldn't recognize, but maybe that was okay. Maybe they'd all grown into exactly who they needed to be. "I'll find them," he said, "or they'll find me. Either way, when we meet again, it'll be as equals." The farewell took 3 hours and more tears than anyone was willing to admit. Each crew member had something to give him: weapons, supplies, advice, promises to stay in touch. By the time it was over, Luffy had enough gear to outfit a small army and enough good wishes to last a lifetime. "Remember," Shanks said as Luffy prepared to board the small ship they'd prepared for him, "a king protects his people, but he also knows when to let them choose their own path." "I'll remember." And Luffy, "When you become Pirate King, not if, when, don't forget where you came from." "Never," Luffy promised. "This crew, this family, it's part of who I am now, part of who I'll always be." He sailed away as the sun set, heading toward an uncertain future with nothing but a straw hat, a devil fruit power, and the absolute certainty that whatever came next, he'd face it on his own terms. Behind him, the red hair pirates watched until his ship disappeared over the horizon. "Think he'll be okay?" Lucky Roo asked. "He'll be fine," Shanks replied, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Better than fine. He's going to change the world." In the distance, storm clouds were gathering, but for the first time in days, they looked less like an ending and more like a beginning. The Straw Hat Pirates were about to be born. The small sloop cut through East Blue's familiar waters like a knife through silk. Luffy had forgotten how peaceful these seas could be. No floating islands or sky-splitting battles, just endless blue stretching toward horizons that promised adventure instead of war. It had been 3 weeks since he'd left the Red Hair Pirates. 3 weeks of sailing alone, thinking, remembering what it felt like to be just Luffy instead of Red Hair's successor, or the boy who started a war. The solitude should have been lonely, but instead it felt freeing. He was heading toward Shimitsuki village first. If the newspapers were right, that's where he'd find Zoro. The village looked exactly the same as he remembered from stories, quiet, traditional, built around the dojo where children learned to swing swords before they could properly walk. What was different was the tension in the air. People moved quickly, keeping their heads down like they were afraid of drawing attention. "Excuse me," Luffy asked a fisherman who was hastily securing his boat. "I'm looking for Roro no Azoro. Is he—" "You don't want to find him, son," the man interrupted, not looking up from his work. "Not unless you've got a death wish." "Why? What's wrong with him?" The fisherman finally looked at Luffy, taking in his appearance, the straw hat, the red sash, the confident posture that came from years of fighting impossible odds. "You're a pirate," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. And Zoro's my friend. Or, he was." "Friend?" The fisherman laughed bitterly. "That demon doesn't have friends anymore, just targets and corpses." Before Luffy could ask what he meant, the sound of steel on steel rang out from the direction of the dojo. Not practice swings, real combat, deadly serious, the kind that ended with someone not getting back up. Luffy ran toward the sound, leaving the fisherman behind. What he found stopped him cold. The dojo's training ground had been turned into a battlefield. 3 men lay unconscious in the dirt, their weapons scattered around them like broken dreams. And standing over them, 3 swords gleaming in the afternoon sun, was someone who might have been Zoro. Might have been if Zoro had been carved from ice and fury. This version was taller, broader through the shoulders, carrying muscle that spoke of constant training pushed beyond normal limits. The scar across his left eye was new, running from forehead to cheek in a clean line that suggested incredible precision from whoever had given it to him. But it was his expression that made Luffy's heart sink, cold, professional, empty of anything resembling the hot-headed swordsman he'd once known. "Next," Zoro called, his voice carrying none of the passion Luffy remembered. "Anyone else want to try for the bounty?" "There is no bounty on me," Luffy said, stepping into the training ground. Zoro turned, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or surprise. "Luffy." His voice was different too, more controlled. "What the hell are you doing here? Looking for you." "We need to talk." "About what? The good old days that never happened." Zoro gestured at the unconscious bounty hunters around them. "In case you hadn't noticed, I'm busy. Busy beating up people who can't fight back." That got a reaction. Zoro's hand moved to his swords, and suddenly the air felt dangerous. "Can't fight back," he repeated softly. "These 3 have a combined bounty of 60 million berries. They came here specifically to kill me for the reward money. But sure, let's call them helpless victims." Luffy looked at the fallen men more carefully. They were armed to the teeth, had the kind of scars that came from serious battles, and even unconscious they looked like killers, professional ones. Why are people trying to kill you? Because I'm very good at my job. Zoro sheathed his swords with practiced efficiency. Bounty hunting pays well when you're the best at it. And I am the best. Since when do you care about money? Since I learned that strength without purpose is just violence. Zoro's smile was sharp as a blade. At least this way, the violence serves a function. They stared at each other for a long moment. Luffy could see the boy he'd known buried somewhere in this stranger's face, but it was like looking at someone through frosted glass, familiar shapes distorted beyond easy recognition. You want to know what happened to me? Zoro asked. The real story, not whatever romanticized version you've been imagining, Luffy nodded. After you left with red hair, I thought I knew what I wanted. Figured I'd train alone, get stronger, eventually challenge Mihawk for the title of world's greatest swordsman. Simple, right? Right. Wrong. Zoro's laugh was bitter. Turns out wandering around challenging random people to fights is a good way to get yourself killed by someone who's not interested in playing fair. First real pirate crew I ran into, they didn't want a duel, they wanted target practice. What happened? I lost, badly, would have died if Mihawk hadn't shown up. Luffy blinked. Mihawk saved you, in a manner of speaking. He killed the pirates, patched me up, then asked if I wanted to learn what real swordsmanship looked like. Zoro's hand moved unconsciously to the scar over his eye. This is what real swordsmanship looks like. Precise, efficient. Deadly, you trained with Mihawk for 2 years. I worked for him, there's a difference. Zoro began collecting the unconscious bounty hunter's weapons, sorting them with professional efficiency. Turns out the world's greatest swordsman makes most of his money hunting pirates for the government, keeps him sharp, pays the bills, and gives him a legitimate reason to test his skills against strong opponents. And you helped him, I learned from him. Every technique he'd mastered, every secret of the blade, every way to kill a man with steel. Zoro held up a particularly fine katana, examining its edge in the light. In return, I became very, very good at ending fights quickly. That doesn't sound like you, doesn't it? Zoro looked at him directly. I always wanted to be the strongest swordsman, right? Well, now I am. Or at least I'm close enough that the difference doesn't matter for most fights. But are you happy? The question hung between them like a sword balanced on its point. For a moment, Zoro's cold mask slipped, revealing something that might have been pain. Happiness is a luxury, he said finally. I chose effectiveness instead. What if you could have both? With what? By joining your crew, Zoro shook his head. I saw the newspapers, Luffy. I know what happened at Marineford. You think I want to be part of that kind of destruction? I think you're scared, Luffy said quietly. The temperature in the dojo seemed to drop 10 degrees. Zoro's hand was back on his sword hilt, and his killing intent was almost visible. Excuse me? You're scared that if you let yourself care about people again, you'll lose them. So you pretend not to care about anything except being strong. I don't pretend anything. Strength is the only thing that matters. Everything else is just sentiment that gets people killed. Is that what Mihawk taught you, among other things? Zoro drew his white sword, Wado Ichimonji, the blade he'd carried since childhood. It looked different now somehow, more alive. He also taught me that there are only 2 kinds of swordsmen in the world, those who cut what they choose to cut and those who cut everything. Which are you? I'm the kind that ends fights. Zoro settled into a stance that looked casual but felt like standing next to a loaded cannon. Speaking of which, if you want me to join your crew, you'll have to prove you're worth following. Meaning, fight me right here, right now. Show me you're strong enough to be a captain or walk away and don't come back. Luffy looked around the training ground, at the unconscious bounty hunters, at the wooden posts carved up by practice strikes, at the serious expression on his old friend's face. You want to fight? I want to see if Red Hair's training was worth the reputation you've been building. And if I win, then I'll follow you, as first mate, as a friend, however you need me. Zoro's smile was sharp but genuine. And if you lose, I won't. Confident, I like that. Zoro drew his other 2 swords, holding them in the 3-sword style that had once seemed impossible, but confidence without skill is just arrogance. What followed was unlike any fight Luffy had ever experienced. Zoro had always been strong, but this version was something else entirely. Every movement was perfect, economical, designed for maximum effectiveness with minimum waste. His swords moved like extensions of his body, cutting angles that shouldn't have existed, creating openings where none should have been possible. But more than technique, it was the mindset that made him dangerous. This wasn't the hot-blooded swordsman who fought with passion and determination. This was someone who approached combat like mathematics, a series of problems to be solved with the appropriate application of force. Luffy found himself being pushed harder than he'd been since fighting Blackbeard. Zoro's attacks came from impossible angles, exploiting weaknesses in his defense that he didn't know he had. Every time he tried to create distance, the swordsman was already there, anticipating his movements like they'd fought 1,000 times before. Gomu Gomu no Jet Gatling. Luffy's fists moved faster than most eyes could follow, each one coated in armament hockey. Zoro's response was to become a whirlwind of steel, his 3 swords moving in perfect harmony to deflect every single punch. Not block, deflect, using the minimum force necessary to redirect Luffy's attacks away from vital areas. "Impressive," Zoro said conversationally as he continued his defensive display. "But you're still thinking like someone who fights with a crew. Fighting like you know someone will watch your back. What's wrong with that? Nothing, if you want to be a follower forever." Zoro's counterattack came without warning, 3 simultaneous strikes that would have carved Luffy into pieces if he hadn't activated Gear Second at the last possible moment. Even then, one blade found its mark, leaving a shallow cut across his ribs. "A captain fights like the fate of everyone who follows him depends on winning," Zoro continued, pressing his advantage. "You fight like losing is an option." That stung, partly because it was true. Luffy had gotten used to having backup, to knowing that Shanks or Beckman or the rest of the crew would bail him out if things went badly. Fighting alone felt strange, unfamiliar, but it also felt right. "You want to see me fight like a captain?" Luffy asked, wiping blood from his lip. "I want to see you fight like someone worth dying for." That was when Luffy stopped holding back. Gear Fourth had changed since Marineford. The power was smoother now, more integrated, like his rubber body and hockey had finally learned to work together instead of fighting each other. When he activated it, the air around him seemed to thicken, reality bending slightly under the pressure of his presence. Boundman. The fight that followed would be talked about in Shimitsuki Village for years afterward. Every clash between rubber and steel created shockwaves that rattled windows. Every impact cratered the ground beneath their feet. The wooden training posts that had stood for decades were reduced to splinters in seconds. But more than the destruction, it was the emotion that made it memorable. This wasn't just a sparring match. This was 2 friends beating the hell out of each other to find out who they'd become. Zoro fought with perfect technique, but Luffy fought with something harder to defend against: absolute conviction. Every punch carried the weight of everyone he'd failed to save. Every kick was powered by the determination to never lose anyone again. Every block was reinforced by the promise he'd made to himself that he would be strong enough, no matter what it cost. In the end, it came down to will versus skill. Zoro's final attack was a masterpiece of swordsmanship, 3,000 worlds, 3 simultaneous strikes that should have ended any fight. Luffy met it with King Kong Gun, a punch that carried every ounce of power he possessed. When the dust settled, both fighters were down. Luffy lay on his back, staring up at the sky, feeling like he'd been hit by a mountain. Beside him, Zoro was in similar condition, his swords scattered around him like fallen leaves. "Well," Zoro said eventually, his voice slightly breathless. "That was educational. Did I pass? The fact that you're asking means you probably did." Zoro struggled to sit up, wincing as several cuts made themselves known. "Most people who can fight like that wouldn't care about my opinion. I care because you're my friend, or I hope you still are anyway." Zoro was quiet for a long moment, looking at his hands. They were shaking slightly, not from injury, but from something deeper. "You know what the worst part about working with Mihawk was?" he asked finally. "What?" "He never cared if I lived or died. Oh, he wanted me to get stronger. It reflected well on his teaching. But if I'd been killed on some random mission, he would have found another student and moved on. That sounds lonely." It was efficient. No emotional attachments to cloud judgment, no relationships to worry about protecting. Zoro looked at Luffy directly. "But you know what I realized during our fight?" "What?" "Efficient isn't the same as right. And being strong isn't the same as being alive." Zoro smiled, and for the first time since Luffy had found him, it looked like the expression belonged to someone he recognized. "I've been dead inside for 2 years, calling it professional development. And now I remember what it feels like to fight for something that matters." Zoro began collecting his scattered swords. Monkey D. "Luffy, would you do me the honor of accepting me as your first mate? Only if you do me the honor of accepting me as your captain." They clasped hands, and something that had been broken for years finally clicked back into place. Not the same as it had been, they were both different people now, shaped by experiences the other couldn't fully understand. but different wasn't necessarily worse. So, Zoro said as they helped each other to their feet, "What's the plan? Are we gathering the old crew or starting fresh? Bit of both, maybe. I want to find the others, see who they've become, but I'm not expecting them to be the same people we would have met 2 years ago. Good thing. Because I'm not the same person I would have been 2 years ago either." Zoro sheathed his swords with practiced ease. Where to first? Luffy thought about that. About Nami's cold professionalism, about Usopp's mysterious heroics, about Sanji cooking at the Barady while somehow becoming a legend in his own right. "Barady," he said finally, "if we're going to do this, we might as well do it over a good meal. Sounds like a plan." Zoro fell into step beside him as they walked toward the harbor. "Captain," the word felt strange and right at the same time, like putting on clothes that almost fit close enough to work, but with room to grow into them. Behind them, the people of Shimitsuki village watched from their windows as the two young men walked toward their ship. Most of them had never seen the demon swordsman smile before. It was, they agreed, a significant improvement. The Straw Hat Pirates were beginning to take shape, and somewhere in the Grand Line, the winds were shifting in ways that would reshape the world. The Barady floated on the calm east blue waters like a defiant middle finger raised at conventional restaurant design. Part ship, part building, part fevered dream of someone who decided that fine dining needed more cannons, it looked exactly the same as Luffy remembered from the stories Sanji used to tell. What was different was the crowd. "Holy shit," Zoro muttered, staring at the line of ships anchored around the floating restaurant. Is that a Marine Admiral's ship? And a Revolutionary Army transport," Luffy added, pointing to another vessel flying Dragon's flag. "And at least 3 pirate crews I recognize from wanted posters. Either they serve really good food here, or Sanji's become famous for more than just cooking." They managed to secure a berth at the far end of the dock, squeezing their small sloop between a marine frigate and a ship that looked like it had been designed by someone with a serious grudge against the concept of structural integrity. The gangplank was barely down before a familiar voice drifted across the water. "Table for 12, and make it fast, we've got a demonstration in 20 minutes. Through the restaurant's windows, Luffy could see controlled chaos. Waiters moved with military precision, carrying dishes that smoked and steamed and occasionally sparkled. Patrons sat at tables that had been arranged like theater seating, all facing toward what looked like a performance space in the center of the dining room. "Demonstration?" Zoro asked. "Guess we'll find out." The maitre d' who greeted them at the door was polite but harried. "Gentlemen, welcome to the Barady. Unfortunately, we're completely booked for the next 3 months, but if you'd like to add your names to the waiting list." "We're here to see Sanji," Luffy interrupted. "I'm sorry, but Chef Sanji is preparing for his exhibition. He's not available tell him Luffy's here." The maitre d' looked at him more carefully, taking in the straw hat, the scar under his eye, the casual confidence that came from fighting impossible odds. "Luffy," he repeated slowly. "As in Monkey D. Luffy, the straw hat. That's me. 1 moment, please." He disappeared into the kitchen, and 30 seconds later the dining room erupted in shouting. Pots crashed, someone screamed what sounded like a very creative curse in 3 different languages, and then the kitchen doors burst open. Sanji hadn't changed much physically. Still tall, still blonde, still dressed like he was attending a formal dinner instead of working in a kitchen. But there was something different in the way he moved, a precision that spoke of fighting as much as cooking. When he saw Luffy, his face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they hadn't been so genuine. Shock, joy, suspicion, and finally something that might have been relief. "You absolute moron," he said, crossing the dining room in quick strides. "Do you have any idea what you've put us through? Disappearing for 2 years, then showing up at Marineford on every newspaper in the world. Nice to see you too, Sanji. Don't nice to see you too me." But despite his words, Sanji was grinning. "God damn it, Luffy, we thought you were dead at least 6 times. Don't play dumb. You think the rest of us haven't been keeping tabs on each other. Nami's got an information network that spans half the Grand Line. Usopp sends letters through his King persona. Even Chopper manages to get word out from wherever the hell he's been hiding." Luffy blinked. "You've all been in contact." "Of course we have. We're nakama, aren't we? Just because you went off to play pirate with a Yonko doesn't mean we stopped caring about each other." The word hit like a punch to the gut. Nakama. He'd almost forgotten what that felt like, the bond between people who'd chosen to be family. "Speaking of which," Sanji continued, "what's with the swordsman? Please tell me you didn't recruit the demon of East Blue without asking the rest of us first." "Hey," Zoro said mildly, "I'm standing right here." "I know. That's why I called you a demon to your face instead of behind your back." "Guys," Luffy interrupted before they could start what looked like a very familiar argument. We don't have time for this. I need to know, are you in? In what? My crew. I'm putting together the Straw Hat Pirates for real this time, but I need to know if you're interested before. He was cut off by the sound of cannon fire. Not the polite boom of a warning shot, but the ear-splitting roar of a full naval bombardment. The Barady shook like a toy in a washing machine, dishes crashed from tables, and through the windows they could see water spouts erupting all around the restaurant. What the hell? Sanji demanded, but Luffy was already moving toward the windows. He knew those ships. Candy-colored vessels that looked like they'd sailed out of a fairy tale, commanded by creatures that definitely hadn't. The Queen Mama Chanter floated at the center of the fleet like a mothership, and standing on its bow was the massive figure of Charlotte Linlin. Big Mom had come to collect on her promise. Straw Hat Luffy, her voice carried easily across the water, amplified by what sounded like living megaphones. Come out and face me, it's time to decide your future. Shit, Zoro muttered. That's a Yonko, you know her, Sanji asked. We have history, Luffy said grimly. He turned to address the panicked restaurant patrons. Everyone needs to evacuate, now. This is about to become a battlefield. Like hell, said a voice from the kitchen doorway. Zeph, the head chef and owner of the Barady, stumped into the dining room on his peg leg. Age hadn't been kind to him, his hair was more gray than gold now, and he moved like a man carrying the weight of years, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. This is my restaurant, he continued, glaring at Luffy like this was somehow his fault. Which, to be fair, it probably was. I've been serving food here for 15 years, and I'm not about to let some overgrown brat with a temper tantrum chase me away. Geezer, Sanji said warningly, that's not some random pirate out there. That's Big Mom, as in one of the 4 emperors, as in someone who could sink this place with a sneeze. Then you better make sure she doesn't sneeze. Before anyone could argue with the old chef's logic, another voice cut through the chaos. Actually, I think we can handle this. Every head in the restaurant turned toward the speaker. She'd been sitting at a corner table, apparently enjoying a meal despite the bombardment outside. Average height, orange hair, wearing clothes that somehow managed to look both casual and incredibly expensive. Nami looked up from her wine glass and smiled. Hello, Luffy, you're late. Nami. What are you doing here? Waiting for you, obviously. She stood up, and Luffy noticed she moved with the same controlled precision he'd seen in Zoro and Sanji. 2 years had changed all of them. Though I have to admit, I expected you to show up with fewer Yonko trying to kill you. How did you know I'd be here? Because I know you, and because Sanji sent word through our network that you'd probably show up eventually. She walked over to the window, studying the fleet arrayed outside with professional interest. Interesting, Big Mom brought her entire armada. That's, what, 40 ships, maybe 50? Can we handle 50 ships? Zoro asked. We, Nami raised an eyebrow. Since when is there a we? Since Luffy asked me to join his crew and I said yes. And you, she looked at Sanji. Are you in, or are you planning to hide in the kitchen while we handle this? I'm a chef, Sanji said with dignity. Chefs don't hide from anything. Good, because I counted at least 3 other crews in the area who might want to get involved. Nami pulled out what looked like a very sophisticated spyglass. Revolutionary Army transport to the north, Marine frigate to the south, and unless I'm mistaken, that's Marco the Phoenix's ship hiding behind the supply depot. Marco's here, Luffy perked up. Whitebeard pirates have been keeping an eye on you since Marineford, probably figured you'd eventually do something stupid enough to need backup. As if summoned by her words, the sound of wings filled the air. Marco landed on the Barady's deck in human form, his blue flames flickering around his shoulders like a living cape. Yo, he said casually, like dropping out of the sky was perfectly normal. Heard you were having Yonko problems. Marco, Luffy grinned, what are you doing here? Same thing everyone else is doing apparently, waiting to see if red hair student is ready to graduate. Marco glanced out at Big Mom's fleet. Hell of a final exam. Enough talking, Big Mom's voice boomed across the water again. Straw Hat, come out and fight or I start sinking everything in sight. Well, Nami said pragmatically, that settles that. Luffy, what's the plan? All eyes turned to him, and Luffy felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Not the borrowed authority he'd carried as part of Shanks' crew, but something that belonged to him alone. We fight, he said simply. All of us, Sanji asked, even though we haven't worked together in 2 years. Especially because we haven't worked together in 2 years. We need to find out who we are now as a crew. Luffy looked around at his friends, changed, grown, shaped by experiences he could only guess at. Besides, someone once told me that Nakama isn't about fighting together perfectly. It's about being willing to fight together at all. Wise words, Marco observed. Who said them? A guy who taught me that being Pirate King isn't about being the strongest person on the ocean. It's about being strong enough to carry everyone's dreams. That was when the first wave of Big Mom's homies hit the restaurant. They came in a tide of candy and rage, gingerbread soldiers with real swords, lollipop spears that could punch through steel, chunks of the Queen Mama chanter itself that had been animated into fighting creatures. Each one carried a piece of Big Mom's soul, making them far more dangerous than they looked. The Straw Hats met them head-on. Zoro moved like a force of nature, his 3 swords carving through animated sweets like they were made of paper. But these weren't the wild, passionate strikes Luffy remembered. Every cut was precise, economical, designed for maximum effectiveness. Sanji fought with his legs, as always, but his techniques had evolved beyond simple kicking. His attacks carried fire, now actual flames that could melt steel and char stone. When he moved, it looked like dancing, if dancing involved setting your enemies on fire with superhuman grace. Nami wielded weather like a weapon, calling down lightning strikes that reduced homies to their component ingredients. But more than that, she commanded the battlefield, directing their defense with tactical awareness that would have impressed a Marine admiral. And Marco fought like someone who'd spent 2 years learning to carry the weight of his former captain's legacy. Every flame that surrounded him burned with the memory of Whitebeard's protection. Every punch carried the promise that no one else would die on his watch. But it wasn't enough. Big Mom's fleet was simply too large, her homies too numerous. For every animated pastry they destroyed, 2 more took its place. The restaurant was taking damage, the dock was on fire, and sooner or later their stamina would run out. That's when the Revolutionary Army arrived. Dragon's ships appeared like ghosts materializing from fog, their black sails cutting through Big Mom's formations with surgical precision. The most wanted man in the world stood at the bow of his flagship, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades challenging impossible odds. "Charlotte Linlin," he called across the water. "You're in East Blue waters without permission. Withdraw immediately." "Dragon," Big Mom's laughter was like breaking glass. "Come to protect your precious son? How touching." The words hit the assembled fighters like a physical blow. Everyone, Straw Hats, Revolutionary Army, even Big Mom's own crew turned to stare at Luffy. "Son," Nami said faintly. "Your father is Dragon," Sanji demanded. "As in, Dragon the Revolutionary. As in, the most wanted man in the world." "Apparently," Luffy said, looking as surprised as anyone. "News to me." "We'll discuss family history later," Dragon said dryly, his ships moving to flank Big Mom's fleet. "Right now, we have bigger problems." He was right. The 3-way battle that followed was unlike anything East Blue had ever seen. Revolutionary Army soldiers, trained to fight impossible odds, clashed with Big Mom's homies while the Straw Hats held the center. Marco and the remaining Whitebeard pirates provided air support, diving and striking like vengeful angels. But at the center of it all, 2 figures faced off on the water itself. Luffy and Big Mom, standing on the ocean's surface as if it were solid ground, their conqueror's haki turning the air between them visible. "So," Big Mom said conversationally, as her soul powers turned the waves around them into grabbing hands. "Ready to join my family, or do I have to beat you unconscious first?" "Neither," Luffy replied, settling into a fighting stance. "I've got my own family already." What followed was a battle that redefined the word epic. Big Mom fought like the force of nature she was, her homies swarming around her like an extension of her will. Her sword Napoleon cleaved the air with strikes that could level mountains. Her homie Zeus created thunderstorms with a gesture. Prometheus turned the very air around them into a furnace. But Luffy had learned things in the past 2 years that even Big Mom hadn't expected. Gear 4th, Boundman was just the beginning. He flowed between forms, now Tankman for defense, Snakeman for speed, variations that Shanks had helped him develop during their training. Each one pushed his rubber powers to their absolute limits, but that wasn't enough. Not against a Yonko fighting at full power. Big Mom's fist, enhanced by armament haki and carrying the weight of her monstrous strength, caught Luffy square in the chest. The impact sent him flying, crashing through 3 of Dragon's ships before finally coming to rest in the ocean. "Luffy!" Nami screamed. He sank beneath the waves, and for a moment the battle paused. Even Big Mom looked surprised. She'd expected him to put up more of a fight. That's when something impossible happened. The ocean around Luffy began to change. Not freezing like Admiral Aokiji's powers, not turning to magma like Akainu's. The water itself was becoming elastic, rubber-like, responding to his will even though he was a devil fruit user who should have been powerless in the sea. Luffy erupted from the waves, but he was different now. His entire body pulsed with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The air around him had taken on the properties of rubber, bouncing attacks back at their senders. Even his haki had changed, becoming more flexible, more adaptable. Impossible, Big Mom breathed. Devil fruit awakening, at your age. I don't know what you call it, Luffy said, his voice carrying a resonance that made the ocean itself seem to listen. I just know I'm done holding back. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a demonstration. Luffy moved like rubber given consciousness, flowing around Big Mom's attacks with impossible flexibility while his counterstrikes carried the accumulated force of every impact he'd absorbed. When she tried to grab him, his body stretched beyond her reach. When she created homies, he turned them against each other by making the air around them elastic. Most importantly, he fought with joy. Not the grim determination he'd carried since Marineford, not the cold precision he'd learned from Shanks' crew. This was the pure, infectious happiness of someone doing exactly what they were meant to do. Gomu Gomu no. The technique he'd been developing crystallized in his mind, drawing on everything he'd learned about his powers, about leadership, about what it meant to carry other people's dreams. King Kong Gatling, the barrage of punches that followed, was beyond counting. Each one carried the weight of his awakened powers, the flexibility of rubber combined with the hardness of haki. Big Mom's defenses, which had withstood attacks from other Yonko, crumbled under the assault. When it was over, the Yonko floated in the water, unconscious but alive. The silence that followed was profound. Every fighter from both sides stared at Luffy in amazement. Well, Dragon said finally, that was educational. Is she dead? Nami asked. No, Luffy replied, his awakened form fading as exhaustion caught up with him. Just taking a nap. Marco flew over, his phoenix flames already working to heal the worst of Luffy's injuries. Kid, do you know what you just did? Beat up someone who was threatening my friends? You defeated a Yonko. In single combat, with witnesses from 3 different factions. Marco's expression was serious. The whole balance of power in the new world just shifted. Around them, Big Mom's fleet was already retreating, dragging their unconscious captain back to Tato land. The Revolutionary Army was preparing to disappear back into whatever shadows they'd emerged from. Even the Marine frigate was quietly slipping away, its captain apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. So, Sanji said into the sudden quiet, anyone hungry? Because I know this great restaurant that serves excellent food, and they're probably grateful enough for not being destroyed to comp the meal. Despite everything, the battle, the revelations, the fact that they just witnessed history being made, everyone laughed. Yeah, Luffy said, settling his straw hat more firmly on his head. Let's eat, we've got a lot to talk about. As they walked back toward the Barady, Zoro fell into step beside him. So, the swordsman said quietly, think we're ready to take on the Grand Line as a crew. Luffy looked around at his friends, old and new, changed by their experiences but still fundamentally the people he'd always known they could become. At Nami's tactical brilliance, Sanji's evolved fighting style, Marco's steady presence. At Dragon's ships disappearing over the horizon, carrying the promise of future alliance. At the vast ocean that stretched toward infinite possibilities. Yeah, he said, grinning for the first time since Ace's death, I think we're ready for anything. The Straw Hat Pirates were officially born. And somewhere in the New World, the remaining Yonko were taking notice. The final island looked like nothing special. After everything they'd been through, battles with Yonko, Revolutionary Army alliances, the slow reconstruction of bonds that had been scattered by time and circumstance, Laugh Tale appeared almost disappointing. Just a small island covered in ancient trees, no different from 1,000 others they'd passed on their journey through the Grand Line. That's it, Usopp asked, adjusting his new captain's coat. He'd finally joined them 3 months ago, bringing with him a ship full of refugees he'd been protecting and stories of adventures that had transformed the lying coward Luffy, remembered into someone who could look danger in the eye and laugh. That's the legendary final island. Looks can be deceiving, Robin said softly. She'd been the last to join their reformed crew, drawn by the promise of finally finding the truth about the Void Century. 2 years of independent research had made her more cautious, more dangerous, but also more determined than ever to uncover the world's hidden history. The log pose is going crazy, Nami observed, studying the navigation instrument with professional interest. It's like the island doesn't want to be found, even when you're looking right at it. Luffy stood at the bow, staring at their destination with an expression that had become familiar over the past year, intense focus mixed with something that might have been anticipation or dread. The closer they'd gotten to their goal, the more thoughtful he'd become. "Something's wrong," Chopper said, his enhanced senses picking up details the others missed. "I can smell smoke and blood." "Recent blood? We're not the first ones here," Zoro concluded, his hand moving instinctively toward his swords. As if summoned by his words, cannon fire erupted from the island's hidden coves. Not the wild bombardment of panicked defenders, but the precise, calculated strikes of someone who'd had time to prepare an ambush. The Thousand Sunny, their new ship, built from the finest materials Frankie could acquire and designed to carry them to the end of the world, shook under the assault. But she held together, her enhanced hull plating absorbing damage that would have sunk lesser vessels. There, Sanji pointed toward a cove on the island's eastern shore. Ship's mast, black sails. And that flag, Luffy didn't need to see the flag to know who was waiting for them. He'd been expecting this confrontation for months, ever since the newspapers had started reporting Blackbeard's movements toward the final stretch of the Grand Line. "Marshal D. Teach," he said quietly. The Blackbeard pirate's ship, if it could still be called a ship, emerged from the cove like something out of a nightmare. It had grown since their last encounter, absorbing parts of other vessels until it resembled a floating fortress more than any conventional vessel. And standing at its bow, grinning with those familiar missing teeth, was the man who'd once made Luffy question everything about his own strength. "Zehahaha, Straw Hat," Blackbeard's voice carried easily across the water. "Right on time. I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." "Teach," Luffy called back. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing you are, looking for the greatest treasure in the world, but here's the thing, I got here first." Blackbeard gestured behind him toward the island's interior. "Already been to the center, already seen what old Roger left behind, and you know what I found?" "What?" "Nothing." Blackbeard's laughter was horrible, full of genuine amusement and malice in equal measure. "Nothing but a pile of old books and some stupid message about inherited will, the great treasure of the Pirate King. It's a joke, a philosophical concept that can't buy you so much as a bottle of rum." The words hit the Straw Hats like a physical blow. After everything they'd been through, after all the battles and sacrifices and desperate struggles to reach this moment. "You're lying," Robin said, but her voice carried uncertainty. "Am I? Go see for yourself. But first you'll have to get past me." Blackbeard's darkness began to swirl around him, turning the air between the ships thick and oppressive. Because even if the One Piece is worthless, killing the next Pirate King definitely isn't. The battle that followed was like nothing any of them had experienced. Blackbeard had grown stronger since their last encounter. His darkness fruit powers evolved to terrifying new levels. He could create voids in reality itself, pockets of absolute nothingness that swallowed attacks whole. When he grabbed Luffy with his darkness-enhanced fist, the rubber man's powers flickered and died, leaving him vulnerable to devastating physical attacks. But Luffy had grown too. The awakening he'd achieved against Big Mom had become second nature now, allowing him to turn the very air around him into rubber. When Blackbeard tried to drain his devil fruit powers, Luffy simply fought without them, using pure haki and physical ability to match his opponent blow for blow. More than that, he fought with the support of a crew that had finally learned to work together as a unit. Zoro carved through Blackbeard's darkness like it was made of silk, his swords enhanced with the kind of advanced armament haki that few swordsmen ever mastered. Sanji moved like fire given form, his kicks carrying enough heat to burn away the shadows that tried to engulf him. Nami called down lightning that somehow found its way through Blackbeard's defenses, while Robin used her knowledge of ancient fighting techniques to anticipate and counter attacks that should have been impossible to see coming. The battle raged across both ships and the waters between them, reality bending under the pressure of two conquerors' haki users fighting at full strength. Every clash created shockwaves that could be felt for miles. Every exchange of blows sent ripples through the air that made the very concept of physics seem negotiable. It was Usopp who turned the tide. The former coward, now captain of his own crew of rescued civilians, had spent 2 years learning that sometimes the greatest courage came from standing between impossible odds and the people counting on you to protect them. His shot, a specially designed explosive round that somehow curved around Blackbeard's darkness, struck the enemy captain in the moment when he was completely focused on overwhelming Luffy. The explosion didn't do much physical damage, but it broke Blackbeard's concentration for just long enough. Luffy's fist, coated in advanced Conqueror's haki and carrying the accumulated force of every punch he'd thrown in the battle, connected with Blackbeard's jaw with the sound of a mountain falling. The would-be emperor flew backward, crashing through his own ship's mast before disappearing into the island's jungle with a sound like thunder. "Is he dead?" Chopper asked, ready to provide medical aid even to an enemy. "No," Luffy said, his enhanced observation haki tracking the fallen pirate's life force. "But he's done fighting for today." The crew looked around at the devastation they'd created, 2 ships damaged, the ocean around them turned to steam by the intensity of their battle, the island's shoreline scarred by stray attacks. "So," Nami said into the sudden quiet, "should we go find this treasure that's apparently not worth anything?" Luffy looked toward the island's interior, where ancient trees concealed secrets that had been hidden for over 20 years. Roger's final message to the world waited somewhere in that jungle, along with whatever truth had been important enough to build an entire legend around. "Yeah," he said. "Let's finish this." The center of Laugh-Tale was marked by a single poneglyph, sitting in a clearing that felt older than civilization itself. But this wasn't like the historical stones Robin had studied for years. This one was different somehow. Alive in a way that had nothing to do with the words carved into its surface. "It's a message," Robin said, her voice barely above a whisper as she read the ancient script. "From Gall D. Roger to whoever found this place." "What does it say?" Luffy asked. Robin was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving across the stone with scholarly precision. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "To the one who inherits my will, you have arrived 24 years too early. The world is not yet ready for what lies beneath, but when it is, you will know. The true treasure was never gold or jewels, but the freedom to choose your own path. Use that freedom wisely, the fate of the world may depend on it." "That's it?" Sanji asked. "That's the one piece?" "Wait," Robin continued reading, "there's more. The weapons that could destroy the world sleep beneath the red line. The government that calls itself World fears their awakening because it knows its authority rests on a lie. When the time comes to choose between order and freedom, remember that freedom without responsibility is just another form of tyranny." She looked up from the stone, tears streaming down her face. "He's talking about the ancient weapons. Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus, they're not just legends, they're real and they're sleeping somewhere under the government's seat of power." And Roger chose not to wake them, Luffy realized. Because 24 years ago, the world wasn't ready for that kind of change. But now we have to decide what to do with that knowledge, a familiar voice said from the edge of the clearing. Everyone spun around to see Shanks emerging from the jungle, looking exactly as Luffy remembered him. Wild red hair, easy smile, missing left arm, and eyes that seemed to see everything. "Shanks," Luffy's face lit up with genuine joy. "What are you doing here?" "Same thing I've been doing for the past 24 years, Shanks replied, settling cross-legged on the grass like they were just having a casual conversation. Waiting to see if Roger's gamble paid off. Gamble? He could have used the ancient weapons, you know, could have torn down the world government, reshaped the world according to his vision. Instead, he chose to trust that someone would come along eventually who could do it better. Shanks' smile was sad and proud at the same time. Someone who would unite the world instead of conquering it. "You think that's me?" "I think," Shanks said carefully, "that you've already started. Revolutionary Army, Whitebeard remnants, your own crew, even some of the smarter Marines, they're all looking to you for leadership now. The question is, what are you going to do with that responsibility?" Luffy looked around at his crew, at friends who'd chosen to follow him despite knowing the cost, at Robin whose tears spoke to a lifetime of searching for truth, at Zoro whose loyalty had survived 2 years of separation and doubt. "I don't want to conquer anything," he said finally. "I just want people to be free to chase their own dreams. Even if some of those dreams conflict with each other. Even if freedom for one person means suffering for another. Then we figure it out together. That's what Nakama do, right? They help each other find solutions that everyone can live with." Shanks was quiet for a long moment, studying Luffy's face with the intensity of someone making a life-changing decision. "You know," he said finally, "that's exactly what Roger would have said." He stood up and walked over to Luffy, reaching for the straw hat that had been their connection for all these years. "Wait," Luffy said, putting his hand on the hat's brim. "If you take this back, what happens to us? What happens to everything we've built?" "Nothing changes," Shanks replied gently. "This hat doesn't make you Pirate King, Luffy. Your choices do, your willingness to carry other people's dreams. Your refusal to accept that the world has to stay broken just because it's always been that way." He lifted the hat from Luffy's head, and for a moment it looked like he might put it on himself. Instead, he held it up to the light, examining the worn straw with something that might have been reverence. "Roger gave this to me when I was about your age," he said quietly. "Told me to hold on to it until I found someone who could wear it properly. Someone who understood that being Pirate King isn't about ruling the seas, it's about being free enough to make the choices that matter." He placed the hat back on Luffy's head, settling it with the same gentle care he'd shown all those years ago in Fuchsia Village. "It's yours now," he said. "Really yours, not borrowed, not held in trust. Yours to pass on to whoever comes after you when the time is right." "And you?" Luffy asked. "What will you do now?" Shanks grinned, and suddenly he looked years younger. "Whatever I want, that's the beauty of freedom, isn't it? Once you give it to someone else, you get to discover what you wanted all along." Behind them, the Poneglyph stood silent in the afternoon sun, its message finally delivered after 24 years of waiting. Around them, the ancient jungle whispered with the voices of everyone who'd ever dreamed of reaching this place. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of approaching ships suggested that their time on Laugh Tale was coming to an end. "Marines?" Zoro asked, hand moving to his swords. "Revolutionary Army," Robin corrected, pointing to the black sails visible through the trees. "Dragon's flagship." "And there," Nami added, consulting her spyglass, world government ships. "At least a dozen of them flying Fleet Admiral colors." "Looks like everyone wants to be here for the finale," Shanks observed. "Good," Luffy said, settling the straw hat more firmly on his head. It's time they heard what Roger really left behind. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a convergence. Dragon's Revolutionary Army, the world government's finest forces, the remnants of Whitebeard's crew, even some of Blackbeard's scattered followers, all arriving at Laugh Tale at the same time. Each faction certain they were about to witness the end of an era. They weren't wrong. Luffy stood in the center of it all, flanked by his crew and facing down representatives of every major power in the world. In his hands, he held a copy of Roger's message, not the cryptic riddles that had frustrated treasure hunters for decades, but the simple, clear truth about what the Pirate King had really discovered. "The One Piece," he announced, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowds, "isn't gold or jewels or some ultimate weapon. It's a choice." Fleet Admiral Sakazuki stepped forward, his magma powers already beginning to manifest. "Stand down, Straw Hat. Whatever lies Roger left behind, they die with you." "No," Luffy replied calmly. "They don't." He looked around at the faces surrounding him, Marines who'd spent their lives believing in absolute justice, revolutionaries who'd fought against tyranny in all its forms, pirates who dreamed of freedom and adventure and the treasure that would make it all worthwhile. "Roger found out about the ancient weapons," he continued. "Found out that the world government has been keeping them locked away not to protect the world, but to protect their own power. He could have used that knowledge to tear everything down and build it back up according to his vision." "Then why didn't he?" Dragon asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Because that wouldn't have been freedom, it would have been just another kind of tyranny. So instead, he chose to trust that someday, someone would come along who could unite the world instead of conquering it." Luffy took off his straw hat, holding it up for everyone to see. "This hat has been passed down through 3 generations of dreamers, from Roger to Shanks to me. Each time, it carried the same message, that true freedom isn't about having the power to do whatever you want. It's about having the wisdom to choose what's right." He put the hat back on his head and looked directly at Fleet Admiral Sakazuki. "I'm not here to destroy the world government, I'm here to offer you a choice. Keep fighting to maintain a system built on lies and fear, or work with us to build something better. Something that serves everyone instead of just the people at the top." The silence that followed was profound. Every person present, Marine, revolutionary, pirate, seemed to be holding their breath. It was Sakazuki who finally broke the silence. "And if we refuse?" Luffy's smile was gentle but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then we'll do it without you, because the world is changing whether you're part of it or not. The only question is whether that change comes through cooperation or conflict." What happened next would be debated by historians for centuries. One by one, starting with some of the younger Marines and spreading outward like ripples in a pond, people began to lower their weapons. Not in surrender, but in something that might have been recognition. Recognition that the man standing before them wasn't offering conquest, he was offering hope. Fleet Admiral Sakazuki looked around at his forces, saw the shift in their expressions, and made the hardest decision of his career. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "A council," Luffy replied. "Representatives from every faction, every nation, every group that has a stake in how the world works. We figure out together how to make things better for everyone, not just the people with the most power." And you'd lead this council? Hell no, Luffy laughed. I'm going to explore the world, have adventures, eat good food, and make sure nobody tries to conquer everything while everyone else is busy building something better. He gestured to his crew. But I've got some very smart friends who'd be happy to help figure out the details. Dragon stepped forward, his expression unreadable. Son, Dad, are you sure about this? Once you start down this path, there's no going back. The world you're trying to create, it might take generations to build. Then we better get started, Luffy replied. Besides, I've got time. Being Pirate King doesn't mean you have to stop being a pirate. The laughter that followed, from Marines and revolutionaries and pirates alike, marked the end of the old world and the beginning of something new. 5 years later, the World Council building rose from the ashes of what had once been Marineford. Its design incorporating architectural elements from every nation that had contributed to its construction. It wasn't beautiful, exactly, too many different styles had been forced to work together, but it was functional, and more importantly, it was neutral ground. Luffy rarely visited, preferring to explore the seas with his crew and leave the day-to-day governance to people who actually enjoyed sitting in meetings. But today was special, the 5th anniversary of what historians were already calling the Great Convergence. How's it going? He asked Nami, who had somehow ended up as the council's chief financial officer despite her complete lack of interest in politics. Better than expected, worse than hoped, she replied, looking up from a stack of reports. The former world government territories are adapting well to local self-governance. The Revolutionary Army has been surprisingly good at transitioning from rebellion to civil service. Even some of the old Marines have found their place in the new order. And the problems? Kaido still holed up in Wano, refusing to acknowledge that the world has changed. Big Mom's back to her old tricks in Tato Land, though she's not actively causing trouble yet. And there are rumors that Blackbeard is building a new crew somewhere in the New World. Sounds like job security for pirates, Luffy observed cheerfully. Sounds like you're enjoying this too much, Nami countered, but she was smiling. Outside the council building, the world continued to change in ways both large and small. Former marine bases had been converted into schools and hospitals. The Celestial Dragon's palaces had become museums, their treasures redistributed to the people who'd suffered under their rule. The Grand Line was still dangerous, but it was no longer controlled by a handful of emperors treating it as their personal playground. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was better. And more importantly, it was still changing, still growing, still reaching towards something even better. Luffy, Chopper's voice carried across the harbor. We're ready to go. The Thousand Sunny sat at anchor, her sails catching the afternoon breeze. The crew was assembled on deck, ready for their next adventure. Rumors of an unexplored island chain beyond the Calm Belt, where ancient civilizations might have left treasures that had nothing to do with world-changing responsibility. Where to this time, Captain? Zoro asked as Luffy swung aboard. Wherever the wind takes us, Luffy replied, settling his straw hat on his head and looking out at the endless ocean that stretched toward infinite possibilities. That's what being free means, right? The choice to go anywhere, do anything, be anyone you want to be. As the Thousand Sunny sailed away from the harbor, other ships began to follow, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. Pirates and former Marines, revolutionaries and reformed nobles, all of them united by the simple desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon. The Age of Dreams had officially begun. And somewhere in the vast blue of the Grand Line, the wind carried the echo of laughter, joy-given voice. Freedom made sound, the promise that no matter how dark the world became, there would always be someone willing to light a candle and share its warmth. The will of D lived on, not in bloodlines or inherited power, but in the simple choice to keep moving forward, no matter what the cost. The greatest treasure in the world, it turned out, was the friends you made along the way. And the dreams you helped each other achieve. The end. What a journey, right? From Shanks' apprentice to the Pirate King who literally rewrote how the world works. That final scene where he chooses cooperation over conquest. Chef's Kiss, drop a comment with your favorite moment. Was it the Big Mom beatdown, the crew reunion, or Luffy basically ending the world government with the power of friendship? Subscribe for more insane One Piece what ifs, and tell me what scenario I should tackle next. Catch you later.